The Holocaust is often told through the names of places built for men: Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald. But north of Berlin, hidden beside a quiet lake and pine forest, stood a camp created for women, a place where cruelty wore a different face, slower, colder, and just as lethal. Ravensbrück. This was the largest Nazi concentration camp built specifically for women. More than 130,000 women and children passed through its gates. Political prisoners, Jewish women, Roma, resistance fighters, mothers, nurses, teenagers. Some arrived alone. Some arrived holding children who would not survive the winter. Ravensbrück was not designed for immediate death. It was designed for endurance, for punishment stretched across months and years, for starvation disguised as discipline, for labor disguised as duty, for medical experiments disguised as science. Here, women were forced to build the camp that would destroy them. They were beaten for standing too straight, punished for looking away, executed not for what they did, but for who they were. Tonight, we begin inside the camp the world spoke about the least, and the women history almost allowed to vanish. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters, and together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The idea of a camp for women. In the years before Ravensbrück existed as a physical place, it existed first as an idea inside the machinery of Nazi control, an idea born from the regime's obsession with order, discipline, and the total domination of society, including the bodies and lives of women, because by the mid-1930s the Nazi state had already filled its prisons and early concentration camps with political opponents, communists, social democrats, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so-called asocials. Many of them, women who did not fit the regime's vision of obedience and racial purity, and these women were scattered across camps designed primarily for men, guarded by SS units that treated them as an inconvenience rather than a category worth controlling systematically. Yet the Nazi leadership, especially Heinrich Himmler and the SS main economic and administrative office, believed that women who resisted the regime represented a unique threat, not because they carried weapons, but because they carried ideas, networks, and influence inside families, workplaces, and underground movements. And in the worldview of National Socialism, a woman who rejected her assigned role as a silent bearer of Aryan children was not just disobedient but dangerous, a corrupter of the future itself, which is why the decision was made in 1938 to centralize the imprisonment of women into a single, purpose-built concentration camp that would allow the SS to refine methods of punishment, forced labor, and psychological control specifically tailored to female prisoners. And this decision was not driven by chaos or desperation but by planning, paperwork, and architectural intent, because Ravensbrück was designed from the beginning to function as a model of gendered repression, a place where the SS could experiment with how far deprivation, humiliation, and exhaustion could go without killing prisoners too quickly, since survival itself was part of the punishment. And so a site was chosen north of Berlin near the village of Fürstenberg, close enough to the capital for inspections and administrative oversight, yet isolated enough that screams, executions, and daily brutality would remain unseen by the outside world, surrounded by forests and a quiet lake that gave the illusion of calm. And construction began with prisoner labor even before the first women officially arrived, meaning that from its first moments Ravensbrück was built through coercion, hunger, and fear, while SS architects laid out barracks, roll call squares, punishment cells, and guard towers in a geometric order that reflected the Nazi belief that suffering could be organized, measured, and controlled like an industrial process. And at the heart of this design was the idea that women could be broken not only through physical violence but through constant uncertainty, through the destruction of privacy, motherhood, and identity, because Ravensbrück was intended to erase individuality and replace it with numbers, categories, and uniforms that stripped prisoners of their former lives. and by the time the camp officially opened in May 1939, just months before the outbreak of the Second World War, the system was already in place, guards trained, command structures established, and rules written that defined every movement, every punishment, and every meal or lack of one. And the first transports of women arrived not as victims of a war yet to begin, but as enemies of the state. In peacetime Germany, political prisoners from across the Reich who had spoken out, organized, or simply refused to conform, women who believed they were being sent to a prison and instead found themselves entering a space where law no longer applied, where SS authority was absolute, and where survival depended on learning new rules that changed without warning. Because Ravensbrück was not merely a place of detention but a laboratory of terror, an institution designed to train guards, test methods, and prove that cruelty could be systematized even against those the regime claimed to protect. And this was only the beginning, because what started as a camp for a few thousand German women would soon expand into a vast network of suffering that drew prisoners from across occupied Europe, transforming Ravensbrück from an administrative solution into one of the central pillars of Nazi repression, long before the gas chambers of the extermination camps came to define the Holocaust in the world's memory. Chapter 1, Segment 2, Arrival, Registration, and the First Shock. For the women who arrived at Ravensbrück in its earliest months, the journey itself was the first stage of disorientation, because transports came without explanation, without destination names, and often without warning, with prisoners loaded into trains under armed guard, carrying only what they could hold, many believing they were being transferred to a conventional prison or labor facility, clinging to the hope that rules, sentences, and some form of justice still applied. Yet as the trains slowed near Fürstenberg and the gates of Ravensbrück came into view, that illusion began to collapse, because what greeted them was not a prison but a militarized landscape of barbed wire, watchtowers, floodlights, and barking guards, a place where the SS presence was immediate and absolute. And upon arrival the women were ordered out of the cars, screamed at in unfamiliar commands, beaten if they hesitated, and driven toward the camp entrance in lines that erased individuality within minutes. And from that moment forward the process of transformation began, a deliberate stripping away of identity that followed a rigid sequence, because Ravensbrück operated on routine as a weapon, and the first routine was registration, a process that reduced human beings to files, numbers, and categories, as women were herded into intake buildings where their names were recorded, their backgrounds interrogated, and their bodies examined not for health but for classification as Jewish, political, criminal, Roma, Jehovah's Witness, or asocial, labels that would determine treatment, labor assignments, and chances of survival. And during this process their possessions were confiscated, wedding rings, photographs, letters, religious items, even glasses and prosthetics, all taken under the pretense of storage but in reality absorbed into the SS economy, while the women themselves were ordered to undress completely in front of guards and fellow prisoners, a calculated humiliation designed to destroy dignity from the first day, and their hair was often cut short or shaved entirely, not for hygiene but for control, because uniform bodies were easier to manage and less likely to resist. And then came the uniforms, thin striped dresses or mismatched clothing marked with colored triangles sewn onto the chest, symbols that turned social categories into visible targets, ensuring that prisoners would police one another out of fear as much as the guards did. And numbers replaced names, shouted during roll call, stitched onto fabric, written into ledgers, so that memory itself became dangerous, because to remember who you had been was to feel lost too deeply. And yet this was only the beginning, because after registration the women were introduced to the camp's rhythm through violence, as they were forced to stand for hours on the roll call square regardless of weather, learning that time in Ravensbrück no longer belonged to them, that hunger, exhaustion, and pain would be constant companions, and that arbitrary punishment was not an exception but a rule, because guards beat women for standing incorrectly, for looking away, for collapsing from weakness, or sometimes for no reason at all, establishing immediately that survival depended not on innocence or guilt but on obedience and luck. And among the guards were female SS overseers, Aufseherin, trained to enforce discipline with particular cruelty, because the SS believed women guards could more effectively break women prisoners through a mixture of contempt, rivalry, and humiliation. And these guards learned quickly that Ravensbrück was a place where restraint was neither expected nor punished, because brutality was part of their training, and the prisoners sensed this instinctively, realizing within days that the camp was designed not to rehabilitate or confine but to grind down bodies and wills through repetition, monotony, and fear, while at night the women were packed into barracks far beyond capacity, sleeping on wooden bunks in tiers, sharing straw mattresses crawling with lice, listening to the sounds of coughing, crying, and whispered prayers, learning the geography of suffering one noise at a time. And for many the first nights brought the realization that this place was meant to last indefinitely, that release was not promised or even defined, and that the rules they tried to memorize could change without notice, because Ravensbrück functioned not as a fixed institution but as a living system of terror, adapting itself to the needs of the SS and the expanding Nazi state. And by the time the women learned how to stand, when to speak, and when to disappear into silence, the camp had already begun its work, because the true purpose of arrival was not registration but reprogramming, turning civilians into prisoners, turning resistance into exhaustion, and turning fear into routine, so that by the end of their first weeks, many women no longer thought in days or weeks at all, but only in roll calls, labor hours, and the thin hope of surviving one more night inside a camp that had been designed from the beginning to make suffering feel normal. Chapter 1, Segment 3, Learning the Rules of a World Without Mercy. After the first days of arrival and registration, the women of Ravensbrück entered the most dangerous phase of camp life not because it was the most physically brutal, but because it was the moment when they had to learn how this new world functioned, a world governed by rules that were never fully explained, constantly shifting, and enforced through terror rather than logic, because Ravensbrück did not operate like a prison with fixed sentences or predictable consequences, but like a system designed to keep prisoners permanently uncertain, permanently afraid, and permanently dependent on obedience for survival. And it was during these early weeks that many women realized that understanding the camp's invisible laws could mean the difference between life and death, as they learned through observation, whispered warnings, and painful mistakes what behaviors attracted punishment and what behaviors merely delayed it, because punishment in Ravensbrück was not corrective but exemplary, meant to be seen, heard, and remembered, so that fear could spread faster than orders ever could, and women quickly learned that standing out in any way was dangerous, that intelligence, leadership, kindness, or defiance could all become liabilities, because anything that disrupted uniformity threatened the SS control, and yet at the same time complete passivity could be fatal as well, because those who collapsed, hesitated, or appeared weak were often selected for the worst labor details or marked as expendable, and so survival required a delicate balance, learning how to appear obedient without disappearing entirely, how to conserve energy without seeming lazy, how to help others quietly without being noticed. And these lessons were learned not in classrooms or manuals but in barracks, work sites, and roll call squares, where mistakes were punished instantly and publicly, as women were beaten, isolated, or sent to punishment blocks for offenses as minor as speaking during formation, failing to salute correctly, or collapsing from hunger during work. And over time the prisoners learned that the SS guards themselves were unpredictable, that one guard might ignore an infraction while another would respond with rage, and that moods, weather, and even boredom could determine who suffered on any given day, which meant that justice as a concept no longer applied, because there was no appeal, no explanation, and no limit, only power exercised for its own sake. And this realization broke many women faster than physical abuse ever could, because it destroyed the expectation that behavior mattered, replacing it with a constant state of anxiety in which every action was a risk. And alongside the guards were prisoner functionaries, women appointed as block elders or work supervisors, often chosen from among German criminals or long-term inmates who were given small privileges in exchange for enforcing discipline. And these women occupied a dangerous position, between the SS and the prisoners, sometimes abusing their power to survive, sometimes using it to protect others quietly, but always reminding newcomers that Ravensbrück was a place where survival often required moral compromise, because refusing to participate in the system could lead to death, while participating meant becoming part of the machinery that harmed others, and this moral pressure weighed heavily on the prisoners, especially political detainees and women from resistance movements, who struggled to reconcile their values with the daily reality of the camp, where solidarity was punished and selfishness was often rewarded. And yet even within this system, small acts of humanity persisted, whispered advice on how to stand during roll call to avoid blows, shared crumbs of bread, warnings about dangerous guards, and these acts became lifelines because information itself was a form of resistance, a way of reclaiming agency in a world designed to strip it away. And as the women learned the rhythms of the camp, they began to understand that Ravensbrück was not static but expanding, that new transports arrived regularly, bringing women from across occupied Europe, each group carrying news of arrests, executions, and worsening conditions beyond the wire, and this constant influx reinforced the sense that the camp was part of something larger, a growing system that fed on war, occupation, and ideology, and that Ravensbrück's role was not temporary confinement but long-term exploitation because as the SS refined their control, labor demands increased, and the camp's population grew more diverse and more vulnerable, and by the end of their first months, many women no longer measured time by calendars or seasons, but by camp routines, by how often bread rations were reduced, by how frequently punishments intensified, by how many names disappeared from roll call without explanation, and it was in this slow adjustment to abnormality that Ravensbrück achieved one of its most insidious goals, because terror was no longer shocking but expected, suffering no longer extraordinary but routine, and the camp succeeded not only in imprisoning bodies but in reshaping perception itself, teaching women to live inside a narrow mental space where survival was the only objective and the outside world felt distant, unreal, or already lost. And yet, even as this psychological transformation took hold, seeds of resistance were quietly forming, because learning the rules also meant learning their limits, understanding patterns, identifying moments of weakness in the system, and recognizing that while the SS controlled the camp, they did not fully control the thoughts, memories, and quiet connections that survived behind the wire, and these fragile inner worlds, built during the earliest weeks of captivity, would later become the foundation for endurance, defiance, and survival in a place that had been designed to make all three impossible. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Building Ravensbrück, a camp designed for control. Ravensbrück did not emerge by accident or improvisation, but as a carefully planned instrument of Nazi power, conceived at a moment when the regime had already learned that terror could be systematized, and that concentration camps were not merely places of detention but laboratories where control over human beings could be perfected, and when construction began in 1938 near the quiet village of Fürstenberg, north of Berlin, the site was chosen deliberately, close enough to the capital for easy inspection by SS leadership, yet isolated enough to hide what would happen behind its fences, and from the very beginning Ravensbrück was envisioned not simply as another camp, but as the central concentration camp for women in the entire Reich, replacing earlier, scattered detention sites and allowing the SS to centralize, standardize, and expand their methods of repression. And as prisoners would later realize, the camp's physical design mirrored its psychological purpose, because everything about Ravensbrück was meant to impose visibility, surveillance, and submission, with wide-open roll-call squares where thousands could be assembled and punished at once, barracks aligned with geometric precision, guard towers positioned to dominate every angle, and barbed wire fences charged with electricity that hummed day and night as a reminder that escape was not an option, and the layout itself communicated a message even before a word was spoken, that this was a place where the SS saw everything and where the prisoners were meant to feel permanently exposed, and construction was carried out largely by male prisoners transferred from Sachsenhausen, another camp already functioning as a model for SS control, and these men labored under brutal conditions to prepare a camp they would never inhabit, clearing land, laying foundations, erecting barracks, and installing infrastructure that would soon be used to imprison tens of thousands of women. And the irony of prisoners building prisons for others was not lost on the SS, who viewed forced labor not only as an economic tool but as a method of humiliation, reducing human beings to instruments of their own oppression. And as the camp took shape, it became clear that Ravensbrück was designed to be expandable, with space allocated for future barracks, workshops, punishment blocks, and administrative buildings, because the SS already anticipated that the categories of women deemed enemies of the Reich would grow as political repression intensified, racial laws expanded, and war spread across Europe. And when the first transports of women arrived in May 1939, they entered a camp that was still under construction, muddy, unfinished, and raw, but already operating according to rigid SS discipline. And these early prisoners, many of them German political opponents such as communists, social democrats, and Jehovah's Witnesses, were forced to complete the camp themselves, hauling bricks, digging drainage trenches, erecting fences, and building the very barracks in which they would later be confined. And this forced participation in the camp's creation served a dual purpose, because it provided cheap labor while also psychologically implicating prisoners in the system that oppressed them, reinforcing the SS belief that resistance could be crushed not only through violence but through exhaustion and moral degradation. And from its earliest days, Ravensbrück was integrated into a broader network of SS authority, overseen by Heinrich Himmler's concentration camp inspectorate, with regulations, punishment protocols, and administrative procedures aligned with other camps, yet tailored specifically for women, because the SS held distinct and deeply misogynistic views about female prisoners, seeing them not only as political or racial enemies but as moral deviants, whose punishment was framed as both political necessity and social purification. And this ideology shaped how the camp functioned, as women were subjected to constant surveillance of their bodies, behavior, and relationships, with sexuality weaponized as a tool of humiliation and control. And as the camp expanded through 1939 and 1940, new categories of prisoners arrived, including Jewish women, Roma women, so-called asocials, and later women from occupied territories such as Poland, France, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union, and each new transport brought linguistic diversity, cultural differences, and varying expectations that the SS exploited to divide prisoners from one another, knowing that isolation and mistrust weakened collective resistance. And meanwhile, the administrative machinery of Ravensbrück grew more sophisticated, with meticulous record-keeping that reduced individuals to numbers, categories, and labor capacity, transforming human lives into data points within a bureaucratic system that prized efficiency over morality. And this bureaucratic violence was as central to Ravensbrück's function as physical brutality, because it allowed mass suffering to be organized, justified, and normalized through paperwork. And by the time the camp entered the early years of the war, Ravensbrück was no longer a temporary detention center but a permanent institution of terror, fully embedded in the Nazi state, supplying forced labor, enforcing ideological conformity, and demonstrating how a modern society could engineer cruelty through planning, infrastructure, and administration. And for the women trapped inside its fences, the camp's very existence sent a chilling message that their suffering was not accidental, not chaotic, and not temporary, but carefully designed, officially sanctioned, and meant to endure for as long as the regime required, making Ravensbrück not just a place of imprisonment, but a blueprint for how totalitarian power could be built brick by brick, rule by rule, until cruelty itself became routine. Chapter 2, Segment 2: Administration, Hierarchy, and the Daily Mechanics of Control. As Ravensbrück moved beyond its initial construction phase, the camp quickly evolved into a fully functioning system of domination governed by rigid hierarchy, obsessive regulation, and constant surveillance. And it was within this administrative machinery that the true nature of Nazi control revealed itself, because while brutality was visible in beatings, punishments, and executions, the deeper violence lay in how every aspect of daily life was organized to strip prisoners of autonomy, dignity, and identity. And at the top of this structure stood the SS commandant and his staff, men who rarely interacted directly with prisoners yet whose orders determined every moment of existence inside the camp, from work assignments to food rations to punishments, and beneath them operated a unique feature of Ravensbrück, the large corps of female SS guards known as Aufseherin, women recruited and trained to enforce discipline, surveillance, and punishment over female prisoners. And, unlike the male SS officers who often remained distant, these guards were a constant presence, walking the camp grounds, entering barracks, overseeing roll calls, and exercising enormous discretionary power over life and death. And many of them were not hardened ideologues at the outset but ordinary women drawn by promises of stable employment, authority, and social advancement, which made their transformation into agents of cruelty all the more disturbing, because it demonstrated how institutional power could reshape behavior, rewarding brutality and punishing empathy, and the camp's internal order was further enforced through a system of prisoner functionaries, known as kapos and block elders, women selected by the SS to supervise others, distribute work, and maintain order within barracks, and while some attempted to protect fellow prisoners, the system was deliberately designed to foster rivalry and mistrust, because survival often depended on cooperation with the SS, creating moral dilemmas that fractured solidarity and forced prisoners into impossible choices. And through this layered hierarchy, the SS achieved control not only through force but through delegation, making prisoners themselves instruments of the camp's discipline. And every day began and ended with roll call, hours-long assemblies in the open air where women were forced to stand motionless regardless of weather, hunger, or illness, while numbers were counted and recounted. Punishments were announced and corpses were displayed as warnings, and roll call served no practical purpose beyond control, because it exhausted bodies, broke spirits, and reminded prisoners that time itself belonged to the SS. And between roll calls, daily life was governed by work assignments that shifted constantly, keeping prisoners off balance, with some sent to construction details, others to workshops, kitchens, or cleaning squads, and later to external labor commandos that supplied the Nazi war. Economy and work was intentionally exhausting and often meaningless, because its primary function was not productivity but degradation, forcing women to expend their last reserves of strength while being yelled at, beaten, and punished for the smallest mistakes. And food, the most powerful tool of control, was rationed according to labor value rather than human need, with watery soup, moldy bread, and occasional scraps barely sufficient to keep prisoners alive, ensuring chronic hunger that dominated thoughts and eroded physical and mental resistance. And hygiene was deliberately neglected, with overcrowded barracks, insufficient water, and inadequate sanitation creating conditions where lice and disease spread rapidly, allowing illness to become another form of punishment. And medical care existed primarily to maintain labor output rather than to heal, with the camp infirmary often functioning as a place where the weak were selected for death rather than recovery. And every interaction between prisoners and guards reinforced the message that rules were absolute yet arbitrarily enforced, because punishments could be inflicted without explanation, for imagined infractions, or simply to demonstrate power, and this unpredictability was itself a weapon, as it prevented adaptation, destroyed trust in logic, and replaced it with constant fear. And language played a crucial role in this system, as SS orders and administrative documents used sanitized terminology that disguised violence behind bureaucratic phrases, transforming beatings into discipline, starvation into rationing, and murder into special treatment, allowing perpetrators to distance themselves psychologically from their actions. And for the women inside Ravensbrück, this bureaucratic cruelty was often more terrifying than open violence, because it suggested permanence, routine, and indifference. And as months turned into years, the camp's administration became increasingly efficient at extracting labor, enforcing obedience, and managing mass suffering, proving that terror did not require chaos but thrived within order, schedules, and paperwork. And Ravensbrück thus functioned not only as a prison but as a living demonstration of how a modern administrative state could normalize oppression through systems, hierarchies, and procedures, making cruelty appear ordinary and resistance feel futile. And in this environment, survival depended not just on physical strength but on navigating an ever-shifting web of rules, relationships, and dangers, where every decision carried consequences and every day was a negotiation with a system designed to crush both body and soul. Chapter 2, Segment 3, Punishment, Terror, and the Systematic Destruction of the Self. Punishment at Ravensbrück was not merely a response to disobedience but a central pillar of the camp's design, carefully calibrated to instill fear, obedience, and psychological collapse, because the SS understood that lasting control could not rely on violence alone but required the constant anticipation of violence, an atmosphere where terror became internalized and self-policing replaced resistance, and from the moment a woman arrived, punishment loomed as an ever-present threat, communicated through shouted orders, public humiliations, and the visible suffering of others, and the rules themselves were deliberately vague and contradictory, ensuring that prisoners could be punished regardless of their behavior, since even strict compliance offered no protection from arbitrary cruelty, and this unpredictability shattered any sense of safety or logic, replacing it with a paralyzing anxiety that followed prisoners even in sleep, and punishments ranged from beatings and food deprivation to confinement in dark cells, force standing for hours or days, and execution. But what unified them was their public nature, because punishment at Ravensbrück was a spectacle designed to educate through fear, forcing others to witness the consequences of defiance, real or imagined, and among the most common forms of discipline were beatings administered by SS guards or prisoner functionaries, often for trivial infractions such as failing to stand straight during roll call, speaking without permission, or appearing too weak to work. And these beatings were not spontaneous outbursts but ritualized acts, delivered with calculated cruelty, sometimes accompanied by mockery or forced confessions, reinforcing the power imbalance between guard and prisoner. And solitary confinement, known as bunker punishment, was another tool of terror, where women were locked in small, dark cells with little air, food, or light, sometimes for weeks, emerging physically weakened and mentally shattered. And for many, the isolation was more devastating than physical pain, because it severed the fragile connections that sustained survival, and forced standing punishments required prisoners to remain upright for hours, often overnight, without moving, leaning, or sitting, while guards patrolled to ensure compliance, and such punishments exploited exhaustion and hunger, pushing bodies already on the brink of collapse into further deterioration, and executions, though less frequent than in extermination camps, were nonetheless integral to Ravensbrück's terror, carried out by shooting, hanging, or later through transfers to killing centers, and these deaths were often announced or displayed, transforming individual murder into collective intimidation. And beyond these formal punishments existed a constant undercurrent of informal violence, where guards exercised personal authority to humiliate, degrade, or harm prisoners without record or consequence. And this blurred line between rule-based discipline and personal cruelty ensured that terror permeated every interaction, and psychological punishment was equally central to the camp system, as women were stripped of names and replaced with numbers, forced to wear degrading uniforms, and subjected to relentless insults that dehumanized them as vermin, criminals, or enemies of the state. And such language was not incidental but strategic, designed to erode self-worth and justify abuse, making victims appear deserving of suffering in the eyes of perpetrators, and family separation intensified this psychological destruction. As mothers were torn from children, sisters separated, and news from the outside world withheld or manipulated, leaving prisoners trapped in uncertainty and grief, and the SS exploited hope as another instrument of control, spreading rumors of release, improved conditions, or transfers to better camps, only to crush these hopes repeatedly, teaching prisoners that expectation itself was dangerous. And over time, this cycle of hope and disappointment fostered emotional numbness, a survival mechanism that protected against despair but also hollowed out inner life. And yet even within this regime of punishment, resistance persisted in subtle forms, as women shared food, whispered encouragement, protected the weak, or sabotaged work assignments at great personal risk, and these acts, though small, represented defiance against a system that sought total domination, and the SS responded by intensifying punishments, escalating surveillance, and refining methods of control, demonstrating that terror was not static but adaptive, evolving in response to resistance, and Ravensbrück thus became a laboratory of suffering, where punishment was continuously tested, adjusted, and perfected, not simply to kill but to break, to transform human beings into compliant bodies stripped of agency and identity. And this relentless assault on both body and mind was perhaps the camp's most insidious legacy, because it revealed how cruelty could be systematized, normalized, and sustained over time, embedded within routines and regulations that disguised moral collapse as order. And for the women who endured Ravensbrück, punishment was not an interruption of daily life but its defining structure, shaping every thought, movement, and decision. And it was against this crushing weight of terror that survival itself became an act of resistance, a quiet refusal to disappear even as the system worked tirelessly to erase them. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Economy of Suffering. From the moment Ravensbrück expanded beyond its original role as a detention camp, forced labor became one of its central purposes, transforming the imprisonment of women into a calculated system of exploitation where suffering was converted into economic value. And the SS viewed the bodies of prisoners not as human lives but as disposable tools to be consumed by the demands of the Nazi war economy, a philosophy that shaped every aspect of work inside and beyond the camp's fences. Because labor at Ravensbrück was never intended to rehabilitate or employ, but to exhaust, control, and extract until nothing remained, and prisoners were assigned to work details almost immediately after arrival, regardless of age, health, or physical condition, with little regard for survival, and these assignments ranged from internal camp labor to external industrial work, each designed to maximize output while minimizing care. And inside the camp, women were forced to build and expand their own prison, hauling stones, leveling ground, constructing barracks, roads, and fences under constant supervision. And this labor was deliberately brutal, often performed with inadequate tools, minimal training, and under relentless abuse, ensuring that injury and collapse were routine rather than exceptional. And beyond construction, prisoners were assigned to cleaning latrines, hauling waste, sorting confiscated belongings, or working in kitchens and workshops, tasks that might appear less deadly but were still structured to humiliate and exhaust. And as the war intensified, Ravensbrück was increasingly integrated into Germany's industrial network, becoming a reservoir of slave labor for armaments and manufacturing companies that cooperated closely with the SS. And women were sent to satellite camps and factories linked to firms such as Siemens, where they produced electrical components, ammunition, and military equipment, often working 12-hour shifts or longer, 6 or 7 days a week, under conditions that ignored basic safety, and injuries from machines were common, but medical care was minimal or non-existent, because an injured worker was simply replaced by another prisoner, reinforcing the camp's logic of disposability, and food rations were never adjusted to match the demands of labor, meaning that prisoners were expected to perform physically punishing work while surviving on starvation-level diets, a deliberate imbalance that accelerated physical decline and increased mortality. And this imbalance was not an oversight but a method, because exhaustion made resistance less likely and death more predictable, and the SS monitored productivity closely, rewarding prisoner functionaries who enforced discipline and punished those deemed slow or weak, creating a hierarchy that forced prisoners into complicity as a means of survival. And this internal stratification deepened divisions, fostering resentment and guilt while deflecting responsibility away from the SS. And outside the factories, work details included forestry, agriculture, and road construction, often in harsh weather, with women forced to stand or march for hours before and after labor, extending the working day beyond what was officially recorded. And failure to meet quotas resulted in beatings, reduced rations, or transfer to harsher assignments, making work itself a continuous test of endurance under threat of punishment. And the psychological impact of forced labor was profound, because it stripped work of meaning and dignity, transforming it into a mechanism of domination where effort brought no reward, only further demands, and for many women, the knowledge that their labor directly supported the Nazi war machine added another layer of torment, as they were compelled to contribute to the system that sought their destruction. And yet within this system, moments of resistance emerged, as prisoners sabotaged products, slowed production, or shared skills to protect one another, acts that carried immense risk but preserved a sense of agency. And the SS responded by tightening controls, increasing surveillance, and intensifying punishments, demonstrating that forced labor was not static but adaptive, evolving to crush defiance, and Ravensbrück thus became a critical node in a broader network where ideology, economics, and terror intersected, revealing how genocide was sustained not only by hatred but by profit and efficiency, and the camp's labor system exposed the moral collapse at the heart of Nazi society, where corporations, administrators, and guards alike participated in exploitation while hiding behind bureaucracy and necessity. And for the women trapped within it, forced labor was not merely a daily ordeal but a slow erosion of body and spirit, a process designed to consume strength, identity, and hope until survival itself became uncertain. And it was within this grinding economy of suffering that Ravensbrück demonstrated one of the most disturbing truths of the Holocaust, that mass atrocity could be organized, normalized, and justified through the language of work, productivity, and order, turning human lives into expendable resources in service of an inhuman system. Chapter 3, Segment 2: Punishment, Discipline, and the Architecture of Fear. Punishment at Ravensbrück was not a reaction to disorder but a deliberate system designed to maintain absolute control through fear, humiliation, and unpredictability, ensuring that every woman inside the camp understood that survival depended not on innocence or compliance, but on endurance and chance, because the SS did not require rules to be broken in order to punish, and discipline was imposed arbitrarily to remind prisoners that their lives were entirely subject to the will of their captors. And from the earliest days of the camp, punishment became a daily presence woven into routine, visible in roll calls, work details, barracks life, and the silence that followed screams. And women could be punished for working too slowly, for standing incorrectly during appel, for speaking without permission, for failing to understand shouted orders in German, or for offenses that were never explained at all, creating an environment where constant anxiety replaced any sense of stability. And the most common punishments included beatings with sticks or whips, often administered publicly to reinforce collective fear. And these beatings were brutal, targeted at backs, legs, and faces, sometimes continuing until the prisoner collapsed or lost consciousness, while others were forced to watch, learning that empathy itself could become dangerous. And beyond physical violence, the SS employed standing punishments, where women were forced to remain upright for hours or even days, sometimes outdoors in freezing temperatures, deprived of food and water, their bodies trembling as exhaustion set in. And solitary confinement was another tool, with prisoners locked into tiny, dark cells where isolation amplified terror, and many emerged disoriented, weakened, or psychologically broken. And Ravensbrück also used humiliation as punishment, stripping women naked in public, shaving their heads, or forcing them to perform degrading tasks meant to erase dignity and identity, reinforcing the Nazi ideology that defined these women as less than human. And one of the most feared punishment practices involved the camp prison, known as the bunker, where interrogations were conducted under torture, and women accused of resistance, sabotage, or minor infractions were subjected to repeated beatings, sleep deprivation, and psychological abuse designed to extract confessions or simply to break them. And executions were carried out within the camp as well, sometimes by shooting, sometimes by hanging, often performed in secrecy but known through rumor and absence, because prisoners quickly learned to count who did not return, and public executions were staged to serve as warnings. forcing prisoners to witness death as part of discipline, ensuring terror became internalized, and punishment extended into medical abuse, where women deemed unfit for work or selected arbitrarily were subjected to experimental procedures without consent, framed by SS doctors as discipline or necessity, blurring the line between punishment and experimentation, and the unpredictability of punishment was perhaps its most devastating aspect, because no amount of obedience guaranteed safety, and this uncertainty eroded trust among prisoners, making collective resistance more difficult, as fear isolated individuals within themselves, and the SS deliberately exploited this by empowering prisoner functionaries, known as capos and block elders, who enforced discipline under threat of punishment themselves, creating a hierarchy where victims were forced into roles of control, deepening moral injury and internal conflict. And while some functionaries abused their power brutally, others attempted to mitigate harm, but all operated under a system designed to implicate them, ensuring that punishment spread responsibility while shielding the SS from direct accountability. And children imprisoned at Ravensbrück were not spared from discipline, as even the youngest. Prisoners faced beatings, deprivation, and terror, demonstrating that punishment was not corrective but absolute, and over time, the constant presence of violence altered behavior, as women learned to minimize movement, suppress emotion, and disappear into silence, a psychological survival strategy that carried its own cost, because it demanded the suppression of identity and expression, and yet despite the overwhelming power of the punishment system, acts of quiet defiance persisted, as prisoners shared food, whispered comfort, and preserved rituals of humanity, gestures that carried severe risk but resisted total domination, and the SS responded by escalating punishments, reinforcing the cycle of repression, and Ravensbrück thus became a laboratory of terror where punishment was refined into a method of governance, demonstrating how a camp could function not only through physical barriers but through psychological control, where fear replaced law and cruelty replaced order. And this architecture of punishment revealed one of the most chilling truths of the Nazi camp system, that violence was not excess but policy, not chaos but design, and for the women who endured it, punishment was not merely a series of acts but an environment, one that surrounded them day and night, shaping every decision, every movement, and every hope, until survival itself became an act of resistance against a system built to destroy both body and spirit. Chapter 3, Segment 3, Survival, Solidarity, and Quiet Resistance. Despite the relentless system of punishment, starvation, and terror imposed at Ravensbrück, survival inside the camp was never only a matter of physical endurance, because to remain alive also required the preservation of identity, memory, and human connection in a place designed to erase all three. And within this environment of calculated cruelty, women from dozens of countries forged fragile networks of solidarity that became one of the camp's most powerful forms of resistance, even though such acts were never recognized as rebellion by the SS, and often went unnoticed except by those whose lives depended on them, and survival began with knowledge, as experienced prisoners taught newcomers how to stand during roll call to conserve strength, how to hide weakness during selections, how to stretch thin soup with imagination and ritual, and how to move through labor details without drawing attention, because visibility could be fatal, and these lessons were passed quietly, often at night, whispered between bunks after exhausting days, transforming experience into protection, and food, the most precious resource in the camp, became a currency of solidarity, as women shared crumbs of bread, traded favors for spoonfuls of soup, or saved portions for the sick, knowing that generosity could shorten their own lives but might save another. And these choices carried immense moral weight in a system that forced constant calculation between self-preservation and compassion. And yet, again and again, women chose connection over isolation, defying the Nazi objective of turning prisoners into purely self-interested survivors, and emotional support proved just as vital as physical aid, as women comforted one another during illness, grief, and despair, holding hands during Appell, reciting poetry, songs, or prayers from memory, and recalling family names, hometowns, and past lives as a way to assert continuity against annihilation, because remembering became a form of resistance, an act of refusal to accept the identity imposed by a number stitched onto fabric, and clandestine education flourished in secret, as teachers held lessons for children and adults alike. Doctors explained anatomy without tools, and intellectuals recreated entire books from memory, not because knowledge could end their suffering, but because it affirmed that their minds remained free even when their bodies were imprisoned. And religious practice persisted quietly, with whispered prayers, improvised rituals, and moments of reflection that provided meaning in a landscape of senseless violence. And women from different faiths often protected one another's practices, recognizing shared humanity over imposed divisions and organized resistance, though rare and extremely dangerous, did exist within Ravensbrück, as political prisoners smuggled information, sabotaged production in subtle ways, and maintained contact with external resistance networks when possible, risking execution if discovered, and some women working in armaments factories deliberately damaged components, slowed output, or misassembled parts, acts that seemed small but carried enormous personal risk, and medical workers among the prisoners attempted to save lives by falsifying records, hiding the sick during selections, or exchanging information about SS plans, demonstrating that resistance was not always dramatic but often quiet, persistent, and moral in nature, and even within the horrifying context of medical experiments, solidarity emerged as women cared for those subjected to surgery, hiding wounds, sharing pain relief when possible, and documenting abuse in memory so it could one day be testified to, because bearing witness became another form of resistance, preserving truth for a future that many would not live to see, and the presence of children in Ravensbrück intensified these bonds as women formed surrogate families, protecting the youngest prisoners, inventing games, stories, and routines to shield them psychologically from the camp's horrors, knowing that childhood itself was an act of defiance in a place designed to extinguish innocence, and these efforts often came at immense cost, as women who protected others faced punishment, starvation, or death. Yet the continuation of care persisted, revealing a truth the SS could not fully control, that terror could suppress behavior but could not entirely erase empathy. And over time, these networks of solidarity created an invisible structure within the camp, one that ran parallel to SS authority, sustaining life not through power but through trust, sacrifice, and shared memory. And while Ravensbrück was designed to isolate, degrade, and destroy, it also became, unintentionally, a space where the depth of human resilience was revealed in its most fragile form, because survival was never guaranteed, and many who resisted quietly did not live to see liberation. Yet their actions ensured that the camp was not only a site of suffering but also a record of courage under impossible conditions. And when liberation finally came, it was these bonds, memories, and testimonies that allowed survivors to speak, to document crimes, and to challenge denial, proving that even in a system built on absolute control, human beings could still choose one another, and in doing so, preserve something the Nazis could never fully destroy. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Forced labor and the camp as an economic machine. By the time Ravensbrück entered its mature phase as a concentration camp, it had fully transformed from a site of imprisonment into an integrated economic machine within the Nazi war system, where suffering was no longer only a tool of punishment but a calculated resource, and forced labor became the central purpose around which daily life, survival, and death revolved, because the SS leadership increasingly viewed prisoners not merely as enemies to be broken, but as expendable labor units to be exploited until exhaustion, illness, or death rendered them useless, and this shift marked a decisive stage in the camp's evolution, as Ravensbrück was absorbed into the wider Nazi war economy, supplying labor for armaments, textiles, construction, and infrastructure at a time when Germany's manpower shortages were growing severe, And women prisoners were systematically integrated into this economy through carefully organized labor details that stripped them of autonomy while extracting every remaining ounce of physical capacity, and work assignments varied widely but were uniformly brutal, ranging from construction projects within the camp to external labor detachments at factories, quarries, and workshops operated either directly by the SS or by private German companies that profited from near-slave labor. And prisoners were marched out daily under armed guard, often before dawn, already weakened by hunger and disease, forced to work long hours with inadequate clothing, tools, or rest, regardless of weather, injury, or physical condition, and failure to meet quotas or maintain pace was met with beatings, deprivation, or transfer to punishment details, reinforcing the principle that labor was compulsory, absolute, and inseparable from terror. And inside the camp, one of the most significant developments was the establishment of large-scale workshops producing uniforms, equipment, and textiles for the German military, where women worked in cramped, poorly lit spaces, operating machines for 12 or more hours a day, inhaling dust and fibers that damaged lungs and skin, while guards enforced silence, speed, and obedience, and errors were punished severely, even when caused by exhaustion. And beyond textiles, Ravensbrück prisoners were assigned to ammunition plants, aircraft component factories, and other industrial sites linked directly to the Nazi war effort, especially as the war intensified and Germany mobilized all available resources. And these external labor camps often proved even more lethal than Ravensbrück itself, because conditions were harsher, medical care non-existent, and oversight more brutal, and women collapsed at machines, died at workstations, or were returned to the camp only when they were no longer capable of labor, at which point they were often selected for extermination elsewhere, illustrating how labor and death were seamlessly connected within the system, and the SS carefully documented labor output, treating human suffering as a statistical variable, while companies that used prisoner labor submitted reports praising efficiency and requesting additional workers, demonstrating how bureaucracy and profit coexisted with mass exploitation. And this relationship between the SS and private industry revealed one of the most disturbing truths of Ravensbrück, that genocide and economic rationality were not separate processes but interlocking systems, and prisoners themselves understood this reality, recognizing that their temporary survival depended on their perceived usefulness, which created an environment of constant anxiety, where illness, injury, or pregnancy could mean removal from labor lists and disappearance, and women were forced to hide symptoms, bind wounds, and conceal weakness, while fellow prisoners sometimes intervened by redistributing labor loads or falsifying reports to protect those at risk, showing again how solidarity operated even within the machinery of exploitation. And labor discipline was reinforced through ritualized humiliation, including roll calls held before and after exhausting shifts, where women stood motionless for hours regardless of weather, as guards conducted counts, punishments, and selections, turning time itself into a weapon. And starvation rations ensured that workers remained permanently weakened, never strong enough to resist but barely capable of continued labor, a balance deliberately maintained by camp authorities. And children imprisoned at Ravensbrück were not exempt from this system, as older children were forced into labor roles while younger ones were often left to deteriorate, highlighting how the camp's logic extended across all ages without moral distinction. And as the war progressed and bombing intensified across Germany, Ravensbrück's labor output became even more critical, leading to overcrowding, expanded facilities, and increasingly brutal work demands, all of which accelerated death rates. Yet from the perspective of the SS, this was considered acceptable attrition, because the camp's function was not preservation but consumption, and Ravensbrück thus became a clear example of how the Nazi camp system evolved into an industrial apparatus, where forced labor was both a means of exploitation and a method of extermination, not through immediate killing, but through exhaustion, deprivation, and calculated neglect. And this transformation marked a critical stage in the camp's history, as Ravensbrück ceased to be merely a place of incarceration and became a cog in a vast economic and ideological machine that fed on human lives while presenting itself as rational, organized, and efficient, laying bare the terrifying normality with which mass suffering was administered under the guise of work, discipline, and national necessity. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Medical Experiments and the Abuse of the Female Body. As forced labor drained the strength of Ravensbrück's prisoners, another layer of cruelty unfolded behind clinic doors and laboratory walls, where the camp became a site of systematic medical abuse, and women's bodies were transformed into experimental objects under the authority of SS doctors who operated with total power and near-total impunity. Because Ravensbrück was not only a labor camp, but also one of the primary locations where Nazi medical ideology was tested on living human beings, particularly women, whose suffering was justified through a language of science, racial theory, and wartime necessity. And these experiments were not isolated acts of sadism but part of a broader medical culture within the Third Reich that rejected ethics in favor of utility, hierarchy, and ideological conformity. And beginning in the early years of the camp but expanding dramatically during the war, selected prisoners were removed from barracks and taken to infirmaries that were anything but places of healing, where procedures were performed without consent, anesthesia, or aftercare, and the victims were often chosen precisely because they were young, healthy, and politically or racially stigmatized, making them, in the eyes of their captors, ideal test subjects. And among the most notorious experiments conducted at Ravensbrück were those involving deliberate infection of wounds, where SS doctors cut into women's legs, inserted bacteria, dirt, glass, or wood splinters, and then observed the progression of infection in order to study treatments for battlefield injuries, while withholding adequate medical care to ensure the experiment followed its intended course. And these women, later referred to by survivors as the rabbits, endured unimaginable pain, swelling, fever, and permanent disability, with some dying from sepsis or complications while others survived only to be left crippled for life, and amputations were performed when infections became uncontrollable, often without anesthesia, turning medical intervention itself into another form of torture. And beyond wound experiments, Ravensbrück also became a site for sterilization procedures, hormone testing, and experiments related to reproductive control, reflecting the Nazi obsession with racial purity and population engineering. And women were injected with substances intended to induce infertility, subjected to radiation exposure, or forced into surgical procedures that destroyed their reproductive organs, all under the guise of medical research, while the psychological trauma of these violations compounded the physical damage, as women were stripped not only of bodily autonomy but of any sense that their future lives might continue beyond the camp. And these experiments were carried out by trained physicians who documented results meticulously, sending reports to higher authorities and medical institutions, illustrating how professional expertise was mobilized in service of cruelty. Rather than healing, and the presence of white coats and clipboards did not mitigate violence but instead normalized it, giving the appearance of legitimacy to acts that would otherwise be recognized as criminal, and prisoners understood that being summoned to the infirmary often meant a fate worse than death, because those who entered experimental programs were isolated from fellow inmates, monitored constantly, and denied the mutual support that helped others endure daily life and fear. Spread through the camp as women whispered warnings, hid injuries, and attempted to make themselves appear unfit for selection, while resistance networks within Ravensbrück sometimes intervened by falsifying medical records, smuggling medication, or alerting potential victims in advance, demonstrating again how solidarity emerged even under the most extreme conditions. And despite these efforts, the power imbalance was absolute, and the SS doctors decided who would live, who would be altered permanently, and who would be allowed to die, and children and adolescents were not spared, as younger prisoners were also subjected to procedures designed to test vaccines or study growth under starvation, reinforcing the camp's role as a place where age, gender, and innocence offered no protection. And the medical experiments at Ravensbrück reveal one of the most disturbing dimensions of the Holocaust, because they show how modern science, detached from ethical restraint, can become an instrument of destruction, especially when embedded within an authoritarian system that rewards obedience and ideological alignment over conscience. And after the war, Surviving victims carried lifelong scars, both visible and invisible, struggling with chronic pain, infertility, disability, and trauma, while many of the perpetrators attempted to reintegrate into civilian medical careers, claiming they were following orders or pursuing research, arguments that would later be examined during war. Crimes trials, but during the years of the camp's operation, no accountability existed within its fences, and the infirmary functioned as another killing ground, quieter than execution yards but equally lethal. And this chapter of Ravensbrück's history underscores how terror was not only enforced through guards and weapons but through institutions traditionally associated with care and healing, turning medicine itself into a mechanism of domination, dehumanization, and annihilation, and leaving behind a legacy that continues to challenge humanity's understanding of how knowledge, authority, and violence can converge when moral boundaries are erased. Chapter 4, Segment 3, Daily Terror, Female Guards, and the Psychology of Control. Beyond forced labor and medical abuse, Ravensbrück was sustained by a system of daily terror carefully designed to break the minds of women as thoroughly as their bodies. And at the center of this system stood the female SS guards, or Aufseherin, whose presence shattered any assumption that shared gender might produce mercy. Because in Ravensbrück cruelty was not limited by sex, and women were fully integrated into the machinery of Nazi oppression, trained, disciplined, and rewarded for enforcing brutality with precision and zeal, and these guards were not incidental figures but a defining feature of the camp's identity. Since Ravensbrück functioned as the primary training center for female SS personnel, who would later be deployed across the concentration camp system, meaning that methods of domination refined here would spread far beyond its fences, and the guards were taught to maintain distance, authority, and fear, to see prisoners not as fellow women but as enemies, degenerates or subhumans whose suffering reinforced their own sense of power and belonging within the SS hierarchy, and daily life in the camp unfolded under constant surveillance. Roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing cold or sweltering heat, punishments imposed arbitrarily, and rules that shifted without explanation, ensuring that prisoners could never anticipate safety or stability, and even minor infractions such as speaking out of turn, failing to maintain posture, or appearing ill, could result in beatings, confinement, or transfer to punishment blocks, while collective punishment was frequently used to enforce obedience, with entire barracks denied food or rest because of the actions of one individual, forcing prisoners into impossible moral dilemmas where survival often came at the cost of guilt and fear, and the female guards wielded whips, clubs, dogs, and authority with equal effect, cultivating reputations that became legendary among inmates, names whispered in terror because certain guards were known for selecting victims for execution, torture, or relentless harassment, and unlike male SS personnel who often maintained formal distance, some female guards engaged in deeply personal cruelty, humiliating prisoners, mocking their bodies, exploiting vulnerability, and turning intimacy itself into a weapon, reinforcing the psychological devastation of captivity. And children and elderly women were not exempt, as guards routinely targeted the weakest prisoners to demonstrate absolute dominance, reinforcing the lesson that compassion had no place in the camp's logic, and Ravensbrück's punishment regime extended beyond physical violence into symbolic degradation. As women were stripped of names and reduced to numbers, forced to wear uniforms that erased individuality, had their hair shaved, and were subjected to public shaming rituals intended to dismantle identity, dignity, and memory, and executions were often staged as spectacles, with prisoners forced to witness hangings or shootings, reinforcing terror through visibility and reinforcing the power of the SS through ritualized violence. And yet, even within this environment, control was never complete, because prisoners developed subtle strategies of resistance that undermined the camp's psychological goals, including the preservation of personal routines, the sharing of stories, the secret teaching of songs, poems, or prayers, and the maintenance of friendships that reaffirmed humanity in a system designed to erase it. and resistance did not always take the form of sabotage or rebellion but often existed as quiet defiance, refusing to internalize the camp's definitions of worth, refusing to see oneself as expendable, and this refusal itself became dangerous because guards recognized solidarity as a threat, responding with isolation tactics that separated friends, punished mutual aid, and encouraged denunciation, creating an atmosphere of mistrust intended to fragment community, and the presence of female guards intensified this dynamic as prisoners struggled to reconcile violence with shared womanhood, a psychological conflict that deepened trauma and confusion, while the guards themselves were shaped by a system that rewarded cruelty and punished hesitation, illustrating how ideology could override personal identity and transform ordinary individuals into agents of terror. And as the war progressed and resources dwindled, discipline grew. Harsher, punishments more frequent, and fear more pervasive, because the SS relied increasingly on intimidation to maintain control over a growing and desperate population. And in these final years, Ravensbrück became a place where suffering was both routine and unpredictable, where survival depended not only on strength but on navigating an ever-shifting landscape of power, personality, and terror, and this daily psychological warfare was as lethal as starvation or disease, because it eroded hope, trust, and the will to endure. Yet the fact that so many women survived Ravensbrück, carrying memory, testimony, and resilience beyond the camp's destruction, stands as evidence that even the most comprehensive systems of control cannot fully extinguish human agency, and Ravensbrück's legacy is inseparable from this tension between domination and resistance, showing how terror was engineered, enforced, and normalized, but also how it was quietly challenged by those it sought to erase, leaving behind a history that forces confrontation with the mechanisms of cruelty and the fragile, enduring strength of the human spirit. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Starvation as Policy, Disease as a Weapon. By the early years of the war, Ravensbrück had fully transformed into a camp where suffering was no longer a byproduct of neglect but a deliberate system, and at the core of this system was starvation, engineered not simply through food shortages but through calculated deprivation designed to weaken, control, and ultimately destroy the women imprisoned there, because in Ravensbrück hunger was not accidental, it was policy, and daily rations were intentionally insufficient for survival, consisting of watery soup made from rotting vegetables, scraps of bread weighed down by sawdust or fillers, and occasional substitutes that provided calories without nourishment, ensuring that prisoners slowly wasted away even as they labored for long hours, and this hunger reshaped every aspect of camp life, dominating thought, conversation, and behavior, reducing existence to the constant calculation of how to endure another day without collapsing. And as bodies weakened, disease followed. Predictably, spreading through overcrowded barracks where sanitation had collapsed, clean water was scarce, and basic hygiene was impossible, and illnesses such as dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, and pneumonia swept through the camp unchecked, killing thousands while the SS watched with indifference, because disease functioned as another invisible executioner, eliminating prisoners without the need for bullets or gas, and medical care, when it existed at all, was reserved for those deemed useful to the camp's labor needs, while the weak, the sick, and the elderly were often denied treatment entirely, left to die in bunks surrounded by other starving women who could do nothing but watch, and infirmaries became places of terror rather than healing, because being sent to the Revier often meant selection for death, medical experimentation, or removal from labor rosters that ensured minimal survival rations, and the SS doctors who oversaw health within Ravensbrück did not operate under principles of care but under racial and ideological hierarchies that defined whose lives were worth preserving and whose were disposable, and starvation accelerated this process by stripping prisoners of physical resistance, making them easier to dominate, punish, and discard, and weight loss became extreme, with women reduced to skeletal forms, their skin stretched thin over bone, muscles wasting away, hair falling out, menstruation stopping entirely, signaling the body's shutdown under prolonged deprivation, and this physical collapse was mirrored psychologically, as hunger distorted perception, eroded concentration, and pushed prisoners into states of exhaustion that blurred time, memory, and identity. And yet, even within this deprivation, the camp administration maintained precise records, tracking labor output, illness rates, and mortality with bureaucratic efficiency, reducing human suffering to statistics that justified further exploitation. And the paradox of Ravensbrück was that while prisoners were worked to death, they were also expected to remain productive, creating an impossible standard that guaranteed failure and punishment, and food distribution itself became a tool of control as capos and block elders, often prisoners placed in positions of authority, were given power to distribute rations, creating hierarchies of survival that bred resentment, fear, and moral anguish because choosing who ate slightly more could mean choosing who lived and who died, and disease outbreaks were often met not with quarantine or care but with mass selections, as entire blocks of sick women were removed and sent to death facilities or abandoned to perish, reinforcing the camp's logic that weakness equaled expendability. And during winter months, starvation was compounded by exposure, as prisoners lacked adequate clothing, shoes, or blankets, forcing them to endure freezing temperatures while already malnourished, accelerating death rates dramatically, and the SS used this seasonal suffering to intensify control. Knowing that weakened bodies were less capable of resistance, escape, or defiance, and yet amid this engineered collapse, prisoners developed fragile networks of mutual aid, sharing crumbs of bread, nursing the sick in secret, trading labor for food, and inventing strategies to stretch survival just long enough to see another morning. Acts that carried enormous risk because generosity itself could be punished as sabotage, but these small gestures preserved a sense of humanity that starvation sought to erase, and Ravensbrück thus became a place where hunger was not simply the absence of food, but a comprehensive weapon that attacked the body, the mind, and the social bonds between prisoners, revealing how the Nazi camp system weaponized biology itself, turning the most basic human needs into instruments of domination. And as mortality rose month after month, the camp's leadership viewed starvation and disease not as failures but as successes, efficient methods of elimination that required minimal resources while maintaining the illusion of order. And this system of slow death ensured that Ravensbrück remained not only a site of imprisonment but a laboratory of suffering, where the destruction of women unfolded quietly, relentlessly, and with devastating precision, setting the stage for the camp's later escalation into mass executions, evacuations, and collapse as the war drew closer to its end. Chapter 5, Segment 2: Medical Abuse, Experimentation, and the Destruction of the Body. As starvation and disease weakened the women of Ravensbrück, another layer of cruelty unfolded behind clinic doors and laboratory tables, where medicine was stripped of its purpose and transformed into a tool of domination, because in this camp the body itself became a testing ground for Nazi ideology, and the white coats worn by SS doctors concealed a system of abuse that masqueraded as science while inflicting lasting harm, and for many prisoners, being summoned for medical examination carried a fear equal to that of punishment or execution, because examinations often marked the beginning of experimentation rather than care, and Ravensbrück became one of the primary sites where female prisoners were subjected to invasive procedures without consent, anesthesia, or concern for survival, all justified by the regime as research for military or racial objectives, and among the most notorious of these were the so-called sulfonamide experiments, in which women had their legs deliberately wounded, bones fractured or muscles cut open, and bacteria introduced to simulate battlefield injuries, after which doctors observed infection progression while withholding treatment, measuring pain, fever, and tissue decay as data points, and many of the women died from sepsis or were left permanently disabled, their limbs amputated or rendered useless, and those who survived carried scars not only on their bodies but in their memories, because the experiments were conducted publicly, often in groups, ensuring that terror spread beyond the victims themselves, and these experiments were not isolated acts of sadism but part of an organized program coordinated with SS medical institutions. reinforcing the idea that science could be subordinated entirely to ideology. And reproductive abuse also became central to Ravensbrück's medical crimes, as women were sterilized through surgery or radiation, often without explanation, as part of the regime's obsession with racial control, and these procedures were frequently botched, leading to infections, hemorrhage, and death, while survivors endured lifelong pain, infertility, and psychological trauma, and pregnancy itself was treated as a crime within the camp, with pregnant prisoners subjected to forced abortions, neglect, or the killing of newborns shortly after birth, reinforcing the camp's mission to erase future generations alongside the present one, and medical selection functioned as another execution mechanism as doctors determined who was fit for work and who was unproductive, with the latter sent to gas chambers at other camps, executed on site or left to die untreated, and the presence of infirmaries did not signify care but classification, because health was defined solely by usefulness to the SS labor system, and ethical boundaries that once defined medicine collapsed entirely, replaced by protocols that prioritized efficiency, documentation, and ideological conformity over human life, and nurses and prisoner doctors were forced into impossible positions, compelled to assist in experiments or risk punishment themselves, creating layers of coercion that blurred responsibility while amplifying suffering, and even pain relief became a bargaining tool, withheld or granted to enforce obedience, extract information, or reward compliance, and the language of medicine itself was corrupted, as charts, diagnoses, and clinical terminology concealed acts of torture behind sterile words, allowing perpetrators to distance themselves emotionally from the harm they caused. And this bureaucratic framing made the violence appear systematic rather than personal, reinforcing the camp's function as an institution rather than a collection of crimes. And yet the women subjected to these abuses understood the reality intimately, as they watched friends carried away on stretchers and never return, or reappear mutilated, broken, and barely alive, and whispers spread through the barracks about which doctors to fear, which procedures meant survival, and which marked the end, creating an underground knowledge network that served as a fragile form of resistance, as prisoners tried to protect one another by hiding wounds, feigning health, or warning others when names appeared on medical lists, and despite the extreme imbalance of power, acts of defiance emerged even here, as some women sabotaged experiments, refused to cooperate when possible, or documented abuses in secret, knowing that testimony might one day outlive the camp. And the cumulative effect of medical abuse at Ravensbrück was not merely physical devastation but the systematic erosion of trust in institutions meant to heal, leaving survivors with lifelong fear of hospitals, doctors, and authority. And when the war ended and evidence of these crimes emerged, Ravensbrück stood as a stark reminder that genocide does not require chaos alone but can flourish within orderly systems when ethics are abandoned and medicine becomes an extension of state violence. And this chapter of Ravensbrück's history exposes how cruelty was normalized through procedure, how suffering was measured and recorded without compassion, and how the bodies of imprisoned women were reduced to instruments for experimentation in a regime that saw humanity itself as disposable, laying bare one of the most disturbing truths of the camp, that terror could wear the face of science, and destruction could be carried out with clipboards, charts, and clinical calm. Chapter 5, Segment 3, Psychological Torture, Humiliation, and the Systematic Breaking of Identity. Beyond hunger, disease, and physical abuse, Ravensbrück perfected a quieter but equally devastating weapon: psychological destruction. A form of violence designed not to kill immediately, but to erase identity, dignity, and the sense of self, because the SS understood that a broken mind often surrendered faster than a broken body, and so the camp was structured to humiliate, isolate, and dehumanize women at every possible moment, beginning the instant they arrived, when names were replaced with numbers, hair was shaved, personal belongings confiscated, and individual history erased in a matter of minutes, signaling that the past no longer mattered and the future was no longer guaranteed. and daily life was organized to reinforce this message relentlessly. As prisoners were subjected to arbitrary rules that changed without warning, ensuring constant anxiety and fear of punishment for offenses they could not predict or understand, and roll calls became instruments of torment, lasting for hours in freezing cold or under scorching sun, forcing women to stand motionless while the sick collapsed beside them and corpses were counted as if still alive. And these rituals were not about discipline alone but about demonstrating absolute power, reminding prisoners that time, comfort, and even survival were entirely controlled by the SS, and humiliation was woven into routine interactions, as guards mocked prisoners' appearances, laughed at their weakness, and forced them to perform degrading acts, stripping naked during inspections, being beaten for perceived slowness, or ordered to watch punishments inflicted on others, creating an environment where shame became communal and unavoidable, and language itself was weaponized, as insults replaced names and orders were barked in tones meant to intimidate rather than instruct, reinforcing the idea that prisoners were objects to be managed rather than human beings to be addressed, and isolation further intensified. Psychological harm, as women were separated from family members, national groups, or anyone who shared their language, preventing emotional support and fostering loneliness, while informant systems encouraged distrust among prisoners, making even whispered conversations feel dangerous, because betrayal could come from anywhere, and punishments were deliberately unpredictable, ranging from beatings to confinement in dark cells, ensuring that fear lingered constantly rather than being confined to specific moments, and for many women, the greatest torment was uncertainty. Not knowing if they would be punished, selected for labor, chosen for experiments, or simply disappear overnight, as rumors replaced information and silence replaced answers, and the SS exploited this uncertainty deliberately, spreading misinformation or staging executions to amplify terror, knowing that fear multiplied when imagination filled the gaps left by facts. And children imprisoned in Ravensbrück experienced a particularly cruel form of psychological abuse, as they were exposed to violence they could not comprehend, forced into adult roles, or separated permanently from mothers, their emotional development shattered by an environment that offered no safety, and the camp's structure ensured that even moments of rest carried anxiety, because nighttime brought inspections, sudden searches, and the screams of punished prisoners echoing through barracks, making sleep fragmented and filled with dread. And, over time, this constant stress eroded mental resilience, leading to depression, emotional numbness, hallucinations, and despair, with some prisoners withdrawing completely, no longer responding to commands or attempting to survive, a state known among inmates as going under, which often preceded death. And yet even within this machinery of psychological destruction, acts of resistance persisted, sometimes quietly and invisibly, as women shared stories of their lives before the camp, taught one another songs or prayers, preserved fragments of culture and language, and supported the weakest among them, understanding that remembering who they were was itself an act of defiance, and humor, though fragile, occasionally surfaced as a survival tool, allowing prisoners to momentarily reclaim agency through whispered jokes or ironic observations that mocked their captors, and solidarity networks formed despite the risks, offering comfort during illness, hiding those in danger, or providing warnings when selections were imminent, proving that the SS could control bodies but never fully conquer human connection. And these small acts carried enormous psychological weight, because they restored a sense of purpose and belonging in a system designed to isolate and fragment. And when liberation finally came, many survivors found that the psychological wounds endured long after physical freedom, as memories of humiliation, fear, and loss shaped their lives for decades, manifesting in nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty trusting others. And the legacy of Ravensbrück's psychological cruelty stands as a reminder that genocide is not only about killing bodies but about destroying identity, autonomy, and meaning, and that the camp's true horror lay not only in the deaths it caused, but in the calculated effort to make women forget who they were, until survival itself became an act of resistance, and remembering became a form of justice. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Medical Experiments and the Destruction of the Female Body. At Ravensbrück, cruelty did not stop at labor, hunger, or humiliation. It entered the realm of medicine, where science was stripped of ethics and transformed into another weapon of terror. And within the camp's infirmaries and barracks, women were subjected to medical experiments that caused lifelong suffering or death, all justified under the language of research and necessity, revealing how deeply Nazi ideology corrupted even the most fundamental principles of care, because Ravensbrück was chosen deliberately as a primary site for experimentation on women, particularly young and otherwise healthy prisoners, whom SS doctors viewed not as patients but as expendable material, bodies to be cut, infected, broken, and observed, and the experiments conducted there were not isolated acts of cruelty by rogue individuals but officially sanctioned projects approved at the highest levels of the SS medical establishment, linked directly to the needs of the German military and the racial theories of the regime, and one of the most notorious categories of experiments involved deliberate injury and infection, where women's legs were cut open to the bone, muscles crushed, nerves severed, and wounds deliberately contaminated with bacteria such as streptococcus, tetanus, or gangrene, sometimes mixed with dirt, wood splinters, or glass to simulate battlefield injuries, and these women were then left without proper treatment so doctors could observe how infections progressed, how pain altered behavior, and which methods might allow German soldiers to return to combat more quickly, while the prisoners screamed, fainted, or slowly deteriorated, often begging for death as relief from agony, and amputations were frequently performed not to save lives but to document outcomes, leaving survivors permanently disabled, unable to work, and therefore often selected later for execution, turning survival into a temporary reprieve rather than an escape. And beyond infection experiments, bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration studies were carried out, involving the removal of healthy tissue, the breaking of limbs, or the transplanting of bones from one woman to another, procedures performed without anesthesia or consent, causing unimaginable pain and infection, and even when anesthesia was used, it was often insufficient, administered carelessly, or withheld deliberately to observe reactions, reinforcing the complete disregard for suffering. And the victims were given no explanation, only orders, dragged into operating rooms by guards, restrained while doctors spoke casually among themselves, documenting measurements and outcomes as if recording livestock rather than human beings, and gynecological experiments added another layer of horror, as women were subjected to forced sterilizations, radiation exposure, injections of toxic substances, or surgical procedures intended to test methods of preventing reproduction, reflecting the regime's obsession with controlling female bodies as vessels of future generations, and pregnancies within the camp were treated as problems to be eliminated, with pregnant prisoners often forced to undergo abortions under brutal conditions or left to give birth without medical assistance, only to have infants taken away or killed, reinforcing the message that motherhood had no place within the Nazi vision of society. And these experiments were conducted by trained physicians, many of whom held advanced degrees and post-war careers, demonstrating how ordinary professional ambition, when fused with ideology and opportunity, could facilitate atrocity, and the camp environment ensured compliance, as refusal meant beating, punishment, or execution, leaving prisoners with no choice but submission, and the psychological trauma compounded the physical pain. Because women knew they were being used deliberately, their suffering intentional, their survival irrelevant except as data, and rumors spread through the barracks about who would be selected next, creating constant dread, as scars, limps, or youth could become reasons for experimentation rather than protection. And yet even in this environment, resistance emerged, as prisoners tried to sabotage experiments by concealing infections, slowing recovery, or protecting one another by exchanging information, warning women when selections approached, or altering appearances to appear less desirable to doctors. and some prisoners risked severe punishment. By caring for experimental victims in secret, cleaning wounds, sharing food, or offering comfort, understanding that compassion itself had become a forbidden act, and after liberation, survivors of the Ravensbrück experiments carried the consequences for the rest of their lives, enduring chronic pain, disabilities, infertility, and psychological scars that shaped their identities and relationships, while many struggled for decades to have their suffering acknowledged. As post-war medical communities were often reluctant to confront the full extent of professional complicity, and the legacy of Ravensbrück's medical crimes stands as a chilling reminder that science without ethics can become a tool of destruction, and that the violation of the female body in this camp was not incidental but central to the Nazi project, revealing how control, ideology, and cruelty converged to turn healing into harm, and how the suffering inflicted in the name of knowledge became one of the darkest chapters in the history of medicine itself. Chapter 6, Segment 2, Forced Labor, Industrial Exploitation, and Slow Extermination. At Ravensbrück, forced labor was not simply a means of punishment or control. It was a central mechanism of exploitation that tied the suffering of imprisoned women directly to the Nazi war economy, transforming the camp into a reservoir of expendable labor where human endurance was consumed as ruthlessly as raw material, because from the moment prisoners arrived, their bodies were evaluated not for survival but for usefulness, sorted according to strength, age, and perceived productivity, and then assigned to work details that ignored health, skill, or humanity, ensuring that exhaustion, injury, and death were inevitable outcomes rather than unintended consequences. And as the war intensified and Germany's manpower shortages grew, Ravensbrück expanded its role as a labor camp, feeding workers into SS-owned enterprises and private German companies that profited from near-free labor while remaining insulated from responsibility for the conditions that destroyed lives, and women were forced to toil in workshops producing uniforms, ammunition components, electrical parts, and military equipment, often working 12 to 14 hours a day under constant surveillance, with quotas set deliberately beyond physical limits so that failure itself became a punishable offense. And inside these factories, hunger and fatigue hollowed bodies, fingers bled onto machinery, eyes strained under poor lighting, and mistakes, inevitable under such conditions, resulted in beatings, confinement, or transfer to even harsher labor details, reinforcing a system where survival depended on an impossible balance between productivity and collapse. And outside the workshops, prisoners were sent to construction commands, quarry work, road building, and camp expansion projects, dragging stones, carrying heavy loads, and digging trenches regardless of weather, illness, or injury, while SS guards enforced pace through blows, insults, and humiliation, turning work into a public spectacle of domination, and winter transformed labor into a test of endurance against cold as well as cruelty, with inadequate clothing and shoes causing frostbite, infections, and death, while summer brought dehydration, heat exhaustion, and the relentless stench of overworked bodies packed together without relief. And the camp administration treated physical breakdown not as a problem to be solved but as proof of expendability, because prisoners who could no longer work were labeled useless, removed from labor lists, and often selected for death through neglect, execution, or transfer to extermination sites, revealing how labor functioned as a slow, bureaucratic form of killing. And children imprisoned at Ravensbrück were not spared, as girls were forced into labor details beyond their strength, their growth stunted by hunger and exhaustion, while their presence served as psychological pressure on adult prisoners, reinforcing the sense that no age offered protection. And women from occupied territories were often assigned the most dangerous and degrading tasks, reflecting racial hierarchies embedded within the labor system itself, where nationality and ethnicity determined both workload and punishment, and the profits generated by this system flowed upward, enriching SS enterprises and private firms that later claimed ignorance or necessity, even as camp records documented output increases alongside rising death rates, exposing how efficiency and extermination coexisted within the same administrative framework, and for the prisoners, forced labor reshaped identity and time itself, reducing days to cycles of work, hunger, and collapse, where survival depended on conserving energy, sharing scraps of food, and supporting one another quietly, because any open resistance invited collective punishment, and yet sabotage emerged as another form of defiance, as women deliberately damaged products, slowed production, or misassembled parts whenever possible, risking severe reprisals to undermine the system that exploited them, and these acts, though small in scale, carried immense moral weight, asserting humanity in a place designed to erase it, and as the war turned against Germany, labor demands intensified rather than eased, with evacuations from other camps swelling Ravensbrück's population beyond capacity, forcing already weakened prisoners into even harsher conditions, where starvation diets could no longer sustain the output demanded, accelerating the cycle of collapse. And when liberation finally came, survivors bore the marks of this exploitation in broken bodies, chronic illness, and lasting trauma, while the factories and companies that benefited often resumed operations after the war with minimal accountability, leaving victims to fight for recognition and compensation decades later. And Ravensbrück's forced labor system stands as a stark reminder that genocide does not operate only through overt killing, but also through organized exploitation, where work becomes a weapon, productivity becomes a measure of worth, and exhaustion itself is engineered as a path toward death, revealing how modern industry, when fused with ideology and unchecked power, can be turned into an instrument of mass destruction disguised as economic necessity. Chapter 6, Segment 3, Medical Experiments, Control over the Body, and the Erasure of Womanhood. At Ravensbrück, control over prisoners did not stop at labor or punishment. It extended into the most intimate territory of all, the human body itself, where SS doctors and medical personnel transformed women into living test subjects, stripping them of autonomy, dignity, and identity under the guise of scientific necessity. And these experiments were not isolated acts of cruelty carried out by rogue individuals, but an integrated part of the camp system, sanctioned by Nazi ideology that viewed certain lives as expendable resources for research, and women selected for experimentation were chosen not because of consent or suitability, but because they were powerless, nameless within the system, and easily erased if they died. And among the most infamous experiments conducted at Ravensbrück were the so-called sulfonamide experiments, in which healthy prisoners, many of them young Polish women, had their legs deliberately wounded, muscles cut open, bones broken and foreign, objects like wood splinters, glass, or dirt inserted into the flesh to induce infection, after which experimental drugs were administered inconsistently or withheld entirely, allowing doctors to observe the progression of gangrene, sepsis, and death, while the women endured excruciating pain without anesthesia, restrained on operating tables, screamed into rags, and returned to overcrowded barracks where wounds festered in filth, and many never recovered, left permanently crippled or killed outright, and those who survived carried visible scars that became lifelong reminders of systematic violation. And beyond infection experiments, Ravensbrück became a site for reproductive abuse, where forced sterilizations, hormone injections, and gynecological procedures were performed without consent, reflecting the Nazi obsession with racial control and population engineering, as women deemed undesirable were robbed of their ability to bear children, their futures erased as thoroughly as their present, and pregnant prisoners faced especially brutal treatment, often forced to undergo abortions, separated from newborns, or left to watch infants die from starvation and neglect, reinforcing a regime that denied not only life but the possibility of life itself. And these practices were accompanied by psychological experimentation and observation, where hunger, isolation, and terror were treated as variables to be measured rather than suffering to be alleviated. And SS doctors recorded data with clinical detachment documenting pain, deterioration, and death in neat handwriting that disguised atrocity as science, while female guards enforced compliance through threats and violence, ensuring that resistance meant punishment not just for the individual but often for entire barracks, and this medicalized cruelty was deeply gendered, targeting women's bodies as sites of control, humiliation, and ideological enforcement because womanhood itself associated with reproduction, care, and continuity posed a challenge to a system built on extermination, and so it was systematically attacked, reduced to flesh to be cut, injected, infected, or discarded, and within the camp hierarchy, those marked for experiments occupied a liminal space, often isolated from other prisoners, feared because association could bring punishment, yet quietly supported through whispered encouragement, shared scraps of food, and acts of solidarity that risked severe reprisal. And these bonds became lifelines, preserving fragments of humanity in an environment designed to obliterate it. And as the war progressed and conditions worsened, experimentation intensified rather than diminished, driven by desperation and ideological fanaticism, with doctors racing to complete studies before the camp's collapse, even as resources dwindled and death rates soared, demonstrating that scientific ambition within the Nazi system was inseparable from cruelty. And when liberation finally arrived, the survivors of Ravensbrück's medical experiments emerged not only physically broken but forced into a new struggle, fighting disbelief, denial, and silence in the post-war world, where many perpetrators escaped justice or received light sentences, and victims were often expected to rebuild their lives without acknowledgement or compensation, and their testimony, painstakingly given in war crimes trials and memoirs, became crucial evidence in exposing how medicine itself had been weaponized, turning healing professions into tools of destruction, and Ravensbrück stands as a warning that progress, science, and expertise are not inherently moral, that when detached from ethics and empathy they can be bent toward unimaginable harm, and the legacy of these experiments continues to shape modern medical ethics, reminding the world that informed consent, human dignity, and accountability are not abstract principles but safeguards written in the suffering of those whose bodies were treated as expendable. And in remembering the women of Ravensbrück, we confront not only the brutality of the past but the fragile boundary between care and cruelty, a boundary that collapses when power is unchecked and humanity is denied. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Resistance behind barbed wire. How women fought back in Ravensbrück. Resistance at Ravensbrück did not look like open rebellion, armed attacks, or dramatic escapes, because such acts were almost impossible inside a camp designed specifically to isolate, exhaust, and destroy women. Instead, resistance took quieter, more fragile, and far more dangerous forms, emerging slowly within a system that punished even the smallest assertion of independence with beatings, torture, or death. And yet, despite constant surveillance, starvation, disease, and terror, thousands of women at Ravensbrück found ways to resist, not only to survive, but to undermine the SS system from within, preserving dignity, solidarity, and truth in a place built to erase them. And this resistance began with the refusal to surrender identity, as prisoners clung to names, languages, memories, and beliefs that the camp sought to strip away, whispering prayers in secret, reciting poetry from memory, teaching children fragments of banned knowledge, and reminding one another that they were more than numbers sewn onto fabric. And for political prisoners, especially communists, socialists, and resistance fighters from Germany, Poland, France, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union, resistance was a continuation of the struggle that had already defined their lives before imprisonment, and many arrived with experience in underground organization, discipline, and secrecy, skills that would quietly shape resistance networks inside the camp. And these women formed clandestine groups within barracks and work details, using coded language, signals, and routines to share information, distribute scarce resources, and protect the most vulnerable, including the sick, the elderly, and children. And one of the most powerful acts of resistance was mutual aid, as women pooled bread rations, shared clothing, hid the weak during selections, and risked severe punishment to carry messages or medicine between blocks, understanding that survival itself was a collective effort in a system designed to pit prisoners against one another, and even in forced labor factories and workshops, resistance continued through sabotage, as women deliberately slowed production, damaged equipment, misassembled parts, or subtly ruined uniforms and munitions destined for the German war effort. Acts that were extraordinarily dangerous because discovery could result in execution. Yet many chose to act anyway, believing that even small disruptions mattered in a war built on industrial efficiency. And education became another front of resistance, as imprisoned teachers, professors, and students organized secret lessons in languages, history, mathematics, and political thought, teaching quietly during roll calls, in latrines, or late at night after exhausting labor, knowing that knowledge itself was a threat to a regime that relied on ignorance and obedience, and children imprisoned at Ravensbrück were often the focus of these efforts. Shielded whenever possible from the worst brutality, taught songs, stories, and moral lessons that affirmed life in a place structured around death. And resistance also took emotional and psychological forms, as women supported one another through grief, shared memories of home, celebrated birthdays without food or gifts, and created moments of beauty through song. Drawings scratched into scraps of paper, or handmade objects fashioned from wire and cloth, acts that affirmed humanity in an environment designed to erase it. And some resistance was overt and organized, especially toward the later years of the war, when international prisoner networks coordinated intelligence gathering, documenting crimes, tracking SS personnel, and preparing testimony in anticipation of liberation, hiding written records in walls, burying notes in the ground, or memorizing names and dates to ensure the truth would survive even if they did not. And these networks were often led by women who understood that bearing witness was itself an act of defiance, because the Nazis relied not only on murder but on silence and denial, and even among those subjected to medical experiments, resistance appeared in moments of refusal, endurance, and solidarity, as women warned others of selections, sabotaged procedures when possible, or chose to support one another through shared suffering rather than isolation. And the cost of resistance was immense, with discovery leading to brutal interrogations, confinement in punishment cells, transfer to harsher camps, or execution. Yet the persistence of resistance at Ravensbrück reveals a truth the SS could never fully extinguish: that power enforced through terror is never absolute, and that even in the most controlled environments, human beings retain the capacity to choose compassion over cruelty, solidarity over submission, and memory over erasure. And when liberation finally came, the survival of these resistance networks ensured that Ravensbrück's story would not vanish like so many of its victims. As former prisoners stepped forward to testify, organize survivor groups, and demand accountability, transforming their underground struggle into a public reckoning. And their resistance did not end with the camp's collapse, but continued in the long post-war fight for recognition, justice, and remembrance, ensuring that Ravensbrück would be remembered not only as a site of suffering, but as a place where women, stripped of everything else, still found ways to resist, to protect one another, and to assert their humanity against a system built to deny it. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The Underground Camp, Organization, Secrets, and the Price of Defiance. As Ravensbrück expanded and the war dragged on, resistance inside the camp evolved from spontaneous acts of compassion into something far more structured and dangerous. An underground world that existed beneath the surface of SS control, built slowly through trust, shared risk, and silence, where women learned how to survive not as individuals, but as a hidden collective operating inside a system designed to isolate and atomize them. And this underground resistance was shaped by the unique population of Ravensbrück, which included a high number of political prisoners, many of whom had already lived clandestine lives before arrest, women who had distributed leaflets, sheltered fugitives, organized strikes, or carried messages for resistance movements across Europe, and these experiences proved critical inside the camp, where survival often depended on understanding hierarchy, exploiting gaps in oversight, and recognizing which guards could be avoided, bribed, or deceived. And, slowly, Almost invisibly, informal leadership structures emerged within prisoner society, often centered around block elders, work detail supervisors, and experienced political detainees who used their positions not to collaborate with the SS, but to quietly undermine its control, falsifying work reports, redistributing food, delaying punishments, and shielding vulnerable prisoners during selections, all while maintaining the appearance of obedience, because open defiance would have destroyed. The entire network and communication became the lifeblood of resistance. As women developed coded phrases, gestures, and routines to pass information without alerting guards, messages were hidden in clothing seams, slipped into latrines, or memorized and recited verbatim to avoid leaving physical evidence. And through these methods, prisoners tracked transports, warned of impending executions or medical selections, and shared news from the outside world that kept hope alive even in the darkest moments. And one of the most dangerous yet vital functions of the underground was intelligence gathering. As women working in administrative offices, factories, or SS households quietly observed documents, overheard conversations, and memorized details about camp operations, prisoner deaths, and SS personnel, knowing that such information could one day be used to hold perpetrators accountable, and this knowledge was often passed along to trusted couriers within the camp, who then spread warnings or stored details for the future, understanding that survival alone was not enough. The truth had to survive as well, and forced labor sites became key nodes of resistance, particularly armaments factories and workshops where women sabotaged production in subtle ways, loosening screws, damaging wiring, weakening materials, or mislabeling shipments, acts that were extraordinarily risky because failure could mean severe punishment or execution. Yet many women continued, believing that even small acts of sabotage were meaningful in a war that relied on mass production and medical experimentation. Areas, among the most horrific zones of Ravensbrück, also became sites of quiet resistance, as women warned one another about selections, exchanged information about procedures, and provided care to the injured despite having no medical supplies, turning shared suffering into collective endurance. And the underground also extended to emotional survival, as women organized secret commemorations for the dead, remembered names and faces, and ensured that individuals did not vanish without acknowledgement, because remembering was itself a form of resistance in a system built to erase identity. And children imprisoned in Ravensbrück were often protected by these networks, hidden during inspections, given extra food when possible, and taught quietly so they would not be reduced entirely to the camp's brutality. And as Allied forces advanced and the SS grew increasingly anxious, resistance intensified, with prisoners preparing for possible evacuations, hiding those too weak to march, destroying incriminating evidence when possible, and preserving records that documented crimes. And these final months were among the most dangerous, as chaos made the SS more unpredictable and violent. Yet even then, the underground held, bound by a shared understanding that survival carried responsibility, to bear witness, to remember, and to speak when silence was no longer enforced at gunpoint. And the cost of this resistance was immense, with countless women tortured, executed, or sent to punishment blocks for suspected defiance, often without proof, because the SS understood instinctively that something within the camp was beyond its control. And yet, despite this repression, the underground endured, proving that even under total surveillance, absolute control was impossible. And when liberation finally came, the existence of these networks shaped the aftermath. As survivors were able to testify with precision, name perpetrators, and describe systems of abuse that the Nazis had tried desperately to conceal, and the resistance that had once existed in whispers and gestures transformed into testimony and memory, ensuring that Ravensbrück would be remembered not only as a place of suffering, but as a site where women, stripped of power, freedom, and safety, still organized, resisted, and refused to let the truth die with them. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Punishment, Betrayal, and the Cost of Being Seen. By the time Ravensbrück reached the later years of the war, The SS had become increasingly aware that control inside the camp was fragile, that beneath the surface of roll calls, work commands, and shouted orders, something resistant and dangerous persisted, and in response, punishment systems were intensified not merely to discipline individuals, but to terrorize the entire prisoner population into silence, transforming punishment into a public spectacle designed to crush any remaining belief in solidarity. And the most feared instrument of this terror was arbitrary violence, because it destroyed predictability, as women were punished not only for actions, but for associations, suspicions, or sheer convenience, creating an atmosphere where anyone could be selected at any time. And this uncertainty was intentional, because a system that feels random is harder to resist, and block punishments became common, where entire barracks were deprived of food, sleep, or shelter because of the alleged wrongdoing of one prisoner, forcing women into impossible moral positions where self-preservation clashed with collective survival, and denunciations increased under this pressure, as some prisoners, broken by starvation, fear, or manipulation, were coerced into informing on others, often without understanding the consequences, and the SS exploited this relentlessly, cultivating mistrust, rewarding betrayal with marginal privileges, and punishing suspected resistance leaders with extreme brutality and solitary confinement. Known as the bunker, became a place of psychological destruction, where prisoners were locked in darkness, deprived of food, beaten, interrogated, and left to lose track of time and identity. And many who entered the bunker never returned, while others emerged physically alive but permanently altered, carrying trauma that would never fully heal. And public executions were staged deliberately within sight of other prisoners, bodies left hanging or displayed as warnings, reinforcing the message that resistance led only to death. Yet paradoxically, these acts often strengthened resolve among those already committed to defiance, because the violence confirmed what they already knew, that obedience offered no real safety, and medical punishment blurred into experimentation, as women accused of sabotage or disobedience were transferred to medical blocks where so-called treatments inflicted agony under the guise of science. Infections were induced, wounds were left untreated, and pain was documented rather than alleviated, turning punishment into data. And the SS guards, many of whom had been trained in Sachsenhausen, applied these methods with bureaucratic efficiency, recording infractions, issuing orders, and maintaining files that reduced suffering to paperwork. And yet within this environment of fear, acts of courage continued, quieter and more dangerous than before, as resistance networks adapted by shrinking, becoming more compartmentalized, so that betrayal could not unravel everything at once, and trust became a scarce but precious resource, earned slowly and guarded fiercely, and women learned to read subtle signs, tone of voice, eye contact, hesitation, to judge who could be trusted, because a single mistake could mean death not only for oneself, but for others, and the psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense, as friendships were strained by fear, silence replaced conversation, and emotional isolation deepened even as physical overcrowding worsened. And yet despite this, the underground did not collapse, because the desire to preserve humanity proved stronger than terror, and even as punishment escalated, prisoners continued to document names, dates, and events in memory, knowing that writing things down was too dangerous, so testimony would have to survive inside minds until liberation, and betrayal, when it occurred, was often understood not simply as moral failure, but as evidence of how thoroughly the camp system dismantled human limits, forcing people beyond what they could endure. And after the war, survivors would speak openly about these painful truths, refusing to simplify history into heroes and villains alone. Because Ravensbrück was a place where survival itself was compromised by coercion, and choices were rarely free, and as the SS attempted to evacuate the camp in the final months, executing prisoners and forcing others onto death marches, the punishment system reached a final, chaotic intensity, guards acting with desperation, cruelty escalating even as the right collapsed, and yet, even then, resistance persisted in fragments. Women hiding the sick, sabotaging evacuation lists, sharing final words, preserving identities. Acts that carried no promise of survival, only meaning, and when liberation finally came, the scars of punishment were visible everywhere, on bodies marked by beatings, on minds shaped by fear, and on memories haunted by loss, but alongside these scars existed proof that terror had not achieved total victory, because the stories survived, the names survived, and the truth survived, carried by women who had endured the full weight of punishment and still emerged willing to testify, ensuring that Ravensbrück would not be remembered only as a camp of suffering, but as a place where terror failed to fully erase resistance, even at its most brutal and unforgiving. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Collapse of Order. Ravensbrück in the final year of war. By late 1944, Ravensbrück was no longer functioning as a controlled system of imprisonment but as a collapsing mechanism of mass suffering, strained beyond every limit by the approaching defeat of Nazi Germany, as transports from evacuated camps across the east poured relentlessly into its gates, swelling the population to catastrophic levels, and what had once been designed to hold a few tens of thousands of women was suddenly forced to absorb far more, with barracks overflowing. Far past capacity, women sleeping packed together on floors, under bunks, or standing for hours because there was nowhere left to lie down, and the camp administration, already brutal, now descended into chaos. As food supplies failed entirely, ration allocations became meaningless numbers on paper, and starvation transformed from policy into inevitability, with daily meals reduced to thin, dirty liquid that provided no nutrition, leaving prisoners skeletal, weak, and barely able to stand. During roll calls that still continued with merciless precision, regardless of weather, illness, or death, and disease spread unchecked through the camp, particularly typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis, carried by lice and filth in conditions where sanitation had completely collapsed. Water was scarce, sewage systems failed, and bodies were no longer removed quickly enough, sometimes lying for hours or days beside the living, and the SS response to this humanitarian catastrophe was not relief, but containment, isolating the sick without treatment, sealing off barracks, and allowing death to thin the population naturally, because in the final logic of the regime, prisoners who died from neglect were just as eliminated as those executed outright, and medical blocks turned into waiting rooms for death, where doctors selected who might still work and who would be abandoned, not based on recovery but usefulness, and forced labor continued even as bodies failed. Women dragged to factories, construction sites, and workshops while collapsing mid-shift, beaten for slowing down, punished for illness, and replaced when they fell, because by this stage prisoners were no longer expected to survive the war, only to be consumed by it, and the guards themselves reflected the unraveling of authority. As discipline among SS personnel deteriorated, brutality became erratic, orders contradictory, and violence increasingly impulsive, fueled by fear of approaching Allied forces and desperation. To maintain control even as the system they served disintegrated, and executions continued alongside this breakdown, often carried out hastily without documentation, as the SS attempted to eliminate witnesses, resistance leaders, and those deemed too weak to evacuate, while crematoria and burial pits could no longer keep pace with the number of dead, leaving visible evidence everywhere. And yet, amidst this collapse, something unexpected occurred within the prisoner population. A shift in perception, as rumors of advancing Allied armies spread through whispers, smuggled information, and distant artillery, giving rise to a fragile sense of anticipation mixed with terror, because liberation was no longer an abstract idea but a looming possibility, and with it came new dangers, as prisoners understood that the final phase of Nazi camps was often the deadliest, marked by evacuations, death marches, and last-minute massacres designed to erase evidence, and underground networks intensified their efforts, collecting information, hiding the sick, falsifying lists, and preparing for the possibility that survival would depend not on obedience but on quick, coordinated action, and women who had endured years of suffering now faced the paradox of hope becoming a new source of fear, because hope could lead to exposure, betrayal, or reckless action, and so it had to be guarded carefully, shared only in fragments, through looks, gestures, and coded phrases, while daily life grew increasingly surreal as camp routines continued in name only, roll calls performed beside piles of corpses, punishments administered by guards who no longer believed in victory but clung to cruelty as habit, and prisoners forced to perform meaningless labor for a collapsing war economy, producing goods that would never reach the front, and Ravensbrück in this final year became less a camp than a dying organism, sustained only by inertia, violence, and the refusal of those inside to surrender entirely, as mothers tried to protect children. Friends supported one another physically and emotionally, and small acts of care, sharing crumbs, cleaning wounds, offering comfort, took on enormous significance in a place where survival itself had become extraordinary, and every day was lived with the understanding that the end was near. But no one knew whether that end would bring freedom or annihilation, and as winter closed in, cold added another layer of suffering. Freezing. Barracks without heat, inadequate clothing turning exposure into a silent killer, and women huddled together at night not for warmth alone but for reassurance, whispering memories of lives before the camp, clinging to identity as a defense against dehumanization, and Ravensbrück, once presented by the SS as an orderly instrument of control, now stood exposed as what it truly was, a machine incapable of sustaining life, collapsing under the weight of its own cruelty, yet still lethal to the very end, setting the stage for evacuations, death marches, and liberation that would soon follow, and marking this final year not as a moment of release, but as the most dangerous and unpredictable chapter in the camp's existence. Chapter 8. Segment 2. Death marches and disappearing prisoners. The SS erases the camp. As the front lines crept closer in early 1945, Ravensbrück entered its most lethal phase, one defined not by structured imprisonment but by frantic attempts at erasure, as the SS leadership concluded that the camp could not be allowed to fall intact into Allied hands, and orders were issued to evacuate prisoners westward in what would later be known as death marches, a final act of destruction carried out under the collapsing authority of a dying regime, and for the women inside. Ravensbrück, evacuation did not mean rescue or relief, but forced movement under conditions designed to kill, as thousands were assembled with little warning, given no food, inadequate clothing, and marched out of the camp under armed guard, often in the freezing cold, toward destinations that were deliberately vague, shifting, or non-existent, because the purpose of these marches was not relocation but exhaustion, exposure, and elimination, and those who could not keep pace. The sick, the elderly, the injured, the very young, were shot on the roadside or left to die, their bodies abandoned in ditches, fields, and forests, unmarked and unnamed, while survivors were driven onward by fear and gunfire, stumbling through villages whose residents watched in silence or terror, unable or unwilling to intervene. And within these columns of suffering, Ravensbrück ceased to exist as a fixed place, becoming instead a moving grave, stretching across northern Germany, as prisoners were split into groups, redirected repeatedly, herded onto roads, trains, or open wagons, only to be marched again when rail lines were destroyed or unavailable. And the chaos of these evacuations mirrored the breakdown of Nazi command itself, with guards receiving contradictory orders, some fleeing their posts, others doubling down on brutality in a final assertion of power, and the distinction between camp discipline and battlefield violence vanished entirely, turning prisoners into targets rather than detainees. And yet even in this chaos, survival depended on collective effort, as women supported one another physically, taking turns carrying the weakest, sharing scraps of food scavenged along the way, helping each other stand after falls, because isolation meant death, and solidarity became the only shield against collapse, while rumors spread through the marching columns. Whispers of nearby Allied units, of camps already liberated, of guards deserting, fueling both hope and danger, because hope could inspire escape attempts, and escape attempts were met with immediate execution, forcing prisoners to weigh the risk of staying against the risk of running, and some did flee, slipping into forests, hiding in barns, aided by civilians at great personal risk, while others were recaptured and killed as warnings, reinforcing the atmosphere of terror that defined these final days. And back at Ravensbrück itself, those not selected for evacuation faced a different fate, as the remaining population, largely the sick, children, and those deemed unfit to march, were left behind in a camp stripped of supplies, staff, and order, effectively abandoned, with SS guards destroying records, dismantling equipment, burning documents, and attempting to conceal evidence of mass murder, while executions continued sporadically to silence witnesses, and the crematorium, long overwhelmed, operated intermittently until fuel ran out, leaving bodies piled openly and undeniable, testament to the scale of death that could no longer be hidden. And the camp's internal resistance networks worked feverishly during this period, hiding women targeted for execution, forging identities, negotiating with guards whose loyalty was wavering, and preparing to preserve evidence for the moment when the outside world would finally see what Ravensbrück had been, because even as the SS tried to erase the camp physically, prisoners understood that memory itself had to survive, and some smuggled written accounts, lists of names, and testimonies out with evacuees or hid them in the camp grounds, trusting that someone, someday, would find them. And as April advanced, the sound of artillery grew closer, air raids shook the region, and the illusion of Nazi control disintegrated entirely, leaving Ravensbrück suspended between abandonment and annihilation, a place emptied of purpose except for death, and for those still inside or staggering along the roads, time lost its meaning. Days blurred into endless movement or waiting, marked only by hunger, pain, and the constant calculation of how long the body could endure. And the death marches from Ravensbrück, like those from so many camps, became one of the final crimes of the Holocaust. Not planned with the bureaucratic precision of earlier extermination policies, but driven by panic, hatred, and a refusal to let victims live to tell the truth. And when liberation finally came to those who survived these marches, it would not arrive as a clean moment of freedom, but as the end of an ordeal that had already claimed countless lives beyond the barbed wire, scattering Ravensbrück's prisoners across roads, fields, and mass graves, and transforming the camp's final chapter into one written not in records, but in footsteps, gunshots, and silence. Chapter 8, Segment 3, Abandonment, Liberation, and the Weight of Survival. By the final days of April 1945, Ravensbrück no longer functioned as a camp in any recognizable sense. What remained was a hollowed-out landscape of barracks, barbed wire, corpses, and people too weak to move. A place the SS had attempted to erase but failed to empty completely. After weeks of evacuations and death marches, only a fraction of the original population remained inside the camp. The gravely ill, children, women collapsing from exhaustion, and those hidden by fellow prisoners in desperate acts of protection. The guards who had once enforced discipline with methodical cruelty were now gone or drifting in and out, some having fled entirely, others stripping uniforms of insignia, discarding weapons, or attempting to pass as civilians. Authority had dissolved, but danger had not. The camp existed in a suspended state between terror and uncertainty, where death no longer arrived by schedule, but by neglect, starvation, and disease. Typhus still raged through the barracks, unchecked and deadly. Water systems barely functioned. Food supplies were non-existent. Corpses lay where they had fallen, sometimes for days, because there was no strength left to move them. For the women who remained, survival had become passive, not resisting, not working, not marching, simply breathing, minute by minute, hoping the world beyond the fences still existed. Inside the camp, prisoner self-administration groups quietly took control of what little order could be imposed. Doctors among the prisoners tried to triage without medicine. Nurses tore fabric into bandages. Older women carried children who could no longer walk. There were no roll calls, no commands, only the shared understanding that something was coming, though no one knew when or from which direction. Rumors moved faster than certainty. The Soviets were near, the Americans were near, the SS would return to kill everyone, the war was already over. Each rumor carried hope and fear in equal measure. On April 30th, Soviet reconnaissance units approached the region, encountering abandoned SS posts and scattered groups of prisoners along roadsides, survivors of death marches who could walk no further. When Soviet troops finally entered Ravensbrück, they found a camp that was not liberated in triumph, but discovered in ruin. There was no resistance, no organized surrender. There was only silence, broken by coughing, crying, and the sound of bodies shifting in overcrowded barracks. The soldiers were confronted with living skeletons, women wrapped in rags, children with hollow eyes, and piles of the dead that testified to crimes no retreat could conceal. Liberation did not arrive as joy. It arrived as shock for the liberators and the liberated alike. Many prisoners did not understand what freedom meant anymore. Some were too weak to react. Others were afraid to leave the camp, having been conditioned to fear the world beyond the wire. Medical teams moved in cautiously, aware that sudden food could kill those already starved, that disease could spread to rescuers, that survival itself had become fragile. Field hospitals were established.
Quarantine zone imposée.
Survivors were washed, deloused, fed in measured portions, and documented. Their names, their numbers, their stories slowly emerging from years of enforced silence. Yet liberation did not erase the damage. Many died days or weeks after rescue, their bodies unable to recover from prolonged deprivation. Others lived, but carried wounds that no treatment could reach. Ravensbrück survivors faced a second ordeal, returning to a world that no longer resembled the one they had lost. Families were gone, homes destroyed, communities erased. For many, liberation marked the beginning of loneliness, displacement, and the burden of memory. And the camp itself did not simply vanish with the war. It became evidence. Soviet authorities documented the site, photographing barracks, execution areas, mass graves, and crematorium remains. Survivors gave testimony, sometimes halting, sometimes fragmented, struggling to put language to experiences that had been designed to defy comprehension. These accounts would later be used in war crimes investigations, though justice would come unevenly and incompletely. Some perpetrators were tried and sentenced. Many escaped accountability. Others reintegrated into post-war society, their crimes buried beneath new identities and political realities. Ravensbrück stood as proof that genocide was not only a male story, not only a battlefield story, but a system that targeted women, children, and the vulnerable with equal calculation. It revealed how suffering could be extended, organized, and normalized, how cruelty could be taught, refined, and exported. For survivors, memory became both a duty and a weight. Some spoke, determined that the world would know. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to reopen wounds that never healed. The camp's liberation did not end its story. It transformed it, from a place of imprisonment into a place of remembrance, from enforced silence into testimony. Ravensbrück's final chapter is not defined by its fences being opened, but by the enduring truth carried by those who lived through it. That survival did not mean victory, that freedom arrived tangled with grief, and that remembering was not optional. Because Ravensbrück was not an accident of war. It was the result of choices, made deliberately, enforced systematically, and justified bureaucratically. And those choices, once made, reshaped human lives long after the last guard fled, long after the last shot was fired, leaving behind a lesson written not in slogans or monuments, but in the voices of women who endured, remembered, and refused to let the camp disappear into silence. Chapter 9. Segment 1. Justice delayed, voices recovered, and the struggle to be heard. In the months and years that followed Ravensbrück's liberation, the camp entered a new and uncertain phase, not as a place of confinement, but as a site of reckoning whose meaning was contested, obscured, and often neglected. For survivors, the end of imprisonment did not bring closure. It brought a confrontation with a world that struggled to understand what had happened to women inside a system designed to erase them quietly. Many were displaced across borders that no longer existed, carrying documents that meant nothing, returning to hometowns where families had vanished, homes were occupied by strangers, or anti-Semitism and political suspicion had simply taken new forms. The trauma they carried was not easily translated into language, especially in a post-war society eager to move forward, rebuild, and forget. In early investigations, Ravensbrück was overshadowed by camps more closely associated with mass extermination, and the suffering of women, starvation, forced labor, medical experimentation, sexualized violence, and the slow attrition of dignity was often dismissed as secondary or less visible. Yet evidence existed in abundance. Soviet authorities conducted initial trials in the late 1940s, prosecuting a number of SS personnel associated with the camp, including female guards whose participation in brutality challenged assumptions about gender and violence. Some were sentenced harshly. Others received comparatively light punishments. Many escaped prosecution entirely, blending into civilian life as Europe fractured into Cold War divisions. Western Allied trials addressed Ravensbrück only partially, and accountability remained uneven, shaped by political priorities rather than the full scope of crimes committed. For survivors, this imbalance compounded the injury. Justice, when it came, arrived slowly and incompletely, filtered through legal systems that struggled to categorize crimes that had been administrative, systematic, and normalized. At the same time, survivors began the long, often solitary work of testimony. Some spoke immediately, compelled by urgency, recording memories while details were still vivid, even if painful. Others waited decades, held back by fear, shame, or the belief that no one wanted to listen. Women who had endured Ravensbrück faced particular barriers. Their experiences did not fit dominant narratives of war heroism or battlefield sacrifice, and their suffering, endured through hunger, disease, forced obedience, and daily terror, was frequently minimized or misunderstood. Yet through memoirs, interviews, letters, and oral histories, their voices slowly formed an archive of resistance against forgetting. They described roll calls that lasted for hours in freezing rain, work details that destroyed bodies, selections that erased friends overnight, and medical procedures inflicted without consent or anesthesia. They spoke of children hidden, songs whispered, solidarity forged in the absence of hope, and moral choices made under impossible pressure. These testimonies challenged simplified views of victimhood, revealing a complex landscape of survival, where compassion and cruelty coexisted, where resistance was not always dramatic but persistent and human. As decades passed, Ravensbrück's physical site became a battleground of memory. Under Soviet administration, parts of the camp were dismantled, repurposed, or altered, reflecting political narratives that emphasized anti-fascist resistance while downplaying the specific targeting of Jews and other persecuted groups. Memorialization was selective, shaped by ideology rather than completeness. Only after German reunification did broader efforts emerge to document Ravensbrück in its full historical complexity, incorporating diverse prisoner experiences and acknowledging crimes that had long been marginalized. Museums, research centers, and educational programs began to restore names to numbers, biographies to statistics, and context to ruins. Survivors were invited back, some for the first time, to walk through a place that had once consumed their lives. These visits were acts of courage, not closure. For many, returning reopened wounds. For others, it offered a fragile sense of recognition that their suffering mattered, that history would not entirely abandon them. Ravensbrück's legacy thus became inseparable from the struggle over who controls memory and whose voices are heard. The camp stands today not only as evidence of Nazi terror, but as a reminder that injustice does not end with liberation, and that silence can persist long after the guns fall quiet. Justice delayed, partial, or denied remains injustice nonetheless. Yet through testimony, education, and remembrance, survivors transformed their pain into a warning that systems of dehumanization do not announce themselves loudly, that cruelty can wear uniforms and paperwork, and that forgetting is never neutral. Ravensbrück's women did not survive to be symbols. They survived to speak, to remember, and to insist that history include them, not as footnotes, but as witnesses whose experiences expose the full cost of a world that chose efficiency over humanity. Chapter 9. Segment 2. Memory Under Pressure, Politics of Remembrance, and the Long Shadow of Ravensbrück. As the decades passed after the war, Ravensbrück did not settle into history quietly. Instead, it became entangled in the shifting politics of memory, where what was remembered, what was emphasized, and what was ignored depended largely on who held power and which narratives served the present. In East Germany, where the campsite lay, official remembrance focused almost exclusively on communist resistance and anti-fascist heroism. Memorials, plaques, and ceremonies highlighted political prisoners who had opposed Nazism, presenting Ravensbrück as a place where socialist courage triumphed over fascist barbarism. While this narrative honored real acts of resistance, it simultaneously narrowed the story, pushing aside the experiences of Jewish women, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, so-called asocials, lesbians, and others whose persecution did not align neatly with state ideology. The suffering of women as women, targeted not only for political reasons but for their bodies, their identities, and their perceived usefulness, remained largely unspoken. In this selective memory, Ravensbrück became symbolic rather than complete, its complexity flattened into a lesson shaped by Cold War priorities. Meanwhile, in West Germany and other parts of Europe, Ravensbrück faded further into obscurity, overshadowed by camps like Auschwitz that had come to represent the Holocaust in the public imagination. The absence of gas chambers on the same scale, and the fact that Ravensbrück was primarily a women's camp, contributed to a hierarchy of suffering in which prolonged starvation, forced labor, medical abuse, and psychological terror were harder to visualize and therefore easier to overlook. This imbalance affected legal accountability as well. Many former SS personnel, including guards and administrators connected to Ravensbrück, reintegrated into post-war society with minimal scrutiny, protected by amnesties, lack of evidence, or simple indifference. For survivors, watching perpetrators live ordinary lives while their own bodies and minds carried permanent scars deepened the sense that justice had been compromised not by ignorance, but by choice. Yet memory did not disappear, it persisted in private spaces. Survivors gathered in small associations, wrote letters to one another, commemorated anniversaries quietly, and preserved documents that official archives had no interest in collecting. Mothers told daughters what had happened. Sisters shared stories that never made headlines. In exile communities, especially among Jewish survivors, Ravensbrück lived on as a name spoken with bitterness and disbelief, a place that seemed to exist at the margins of public awareness despite its vast scale of suffering. When German reunification arrived in the early 1990s, it marked a turning point. Access to archives expanded, ideological barriers weakened, and a new generation of historians began to reassess Ravensbrück not as a symbol, but as a system. Research uncovered the full diversity of prisoner populations, the scope of forced labor networks linked to German industry, the extent of medical experimentation on women's bodies, and the central role Ravensbrück played in supplying female guards to other camps across the Reich. The camp emerged not as an isolated anomaly, but as a core institution in the Nazi machinery of repression. Memorial practices slowly changed. The site was redesigned to include exhibitions that confronted uncomfortable truths, acknowledging crimes that had long been minimized. Survivor testimony was integrated into educational programs, allowing visitors to encounter Ravensbrück not only through ruins and statistics, but through voices that described daily life, fear, solidarity, and loss. Still, these changes were neither smooth nor uncontested. Debates erupted over how much emphasis to place on gender-specific violence, how to represent perpetrators without sensationalism, and how to honor victims without reducing them to passive figures. Memory proved fragile, always at risk of distortion, neglect, or appropriation. At the same time, the world beyond Germany changed, and with it the relevance of Ravensbrück. As genocides and mass atrocities occurred elsewhere, survivors and scholars warned against treating the camp as a relic of a uniquely evil past. They emphasized the patterns Ravensbrück revealed: how bureaucratic language concealed brutality, how social exclusion became policy, how obedience was rewarded, and how violence escalated incrementally until it appeared normal. These lessons gave Ravensbrück a disturbing modern resonance. The camp's history showed that mass suffering does not require secrecy. It requires acceptance. That systems of oppression are often maintained not by fanatics alone, but by administrators, guards, clerks, and engineers who perform their roles without questioning the moral cost. As survivor numbers dwindled with age, urgency replaced patience. Each death meant a voice lost, a memory at risk of fading into abstraction. Survivors who once doubted anyone would listen now found themselves speaking to classrooms, journalists, and filmmakers, driven by the fear that silence would return after they were gone. Ravensbrück thus entered a final phase of remembrance, one shaped by transition, where lived memory gives way to recorded history. The responsibility shifts from witnesses to listeners, from survivors to societies. What remains is not only the physical site or the museum displays, but the ethical question Ravensbrück poses: how a civilized nation transformed suffering into routine, and how easily such transformations can occur again when exclusion, fear, and obedience go unchallenged. Memory, the survivors insisted, is not about mourning alone. It is about vigilance. And Ravensbrück, long overlooked, stands as proof that forgetting is never accidental. It is always a decision. Chapter 9, Segment 3, The Last Witnesses, Inherited Memory, and Why Ravensbrück Still Matters. As the 21st century advances, Ravensbrück stands at a fragile threshold between living memory and historical inheritance. The women who survived the camp, those who carried its hunger in their bones, its terror in their sleep, and its losses in their silence, are disappearing one by one. With each passing year, fewer remain who can say, "I was there." This reality has transformed Ravensbrück from a place remembered by witnesses into a place entrusted to descendants, scholars, educators, and visitors who never experienced its horrors firsthand. The shift is profound. Living testimony carries an immediacy that no archive can replicate. The trembling pause in a survivor's voice, the precise detail of a smell, the way memory returns uninvited decades later. When those voices fall silent, the danger is not that history vanishes, but that it becomes distant, abstract, and easier to misuse. Survivors of Ravensbrück understood this risk deeply. Many spoke not because it healed them, but because silence had already proven deadly once. They warned that camps like Ravensbrück were not accidents of madness, but results of deliberate choices made step by step, choices that felt ordinary at the time. Laws were passed, categories were created, people were labeled, Resources were redirected. Violence was normalized. Each stage seemed manageable, even logical, until the system was complete and suffering became routine. This was the lesson survivors tried to pass on. That genocide does not arrive suddenly, but grows inside bureaucracy, language, and obedience. In this sense, Ravensbrück is not only a site of historical memory, but a case study in how modern societies can dismantle human dignity without chaos or spectacle. Its victims were not killed in a single moment of frenzy, but broken over time through forced labor, hunger, punishment, and neglect. Their destruction was slow enough to appear administrative, distant enough to feel impersonal. That is why Ravensbrück matters today. It exposes how violence can be disguised as order, how cruelty can wear the face of efficiency, and how entire populations can be conditioned to accept the unacceptable. As contemporary societies grapple with rising authoritarianism, dehumanizing rhetoric, and the erosion of civil protections, Ravensbrück offers no comfort, only warning. The camp shows what happens when categories replace people, when usefulness determines worth, and when empathy is framed as weakness. It also reveals another truth that survivors insisted upon, that even within systems designed to annihilate, human agency does not disappear completely. Acts of resistance at Ravensbrück were often small. Sharing food, hiding a sick woman during roll call, passing information, teaching children in secret. Yet they preserved something the SS could not fully control. These actions did not overthrow the camp, but they undermined its ultimate goal, total domination of the human spirit. Remembering Ravensbrück, therefore, is not only about acknowledging suffering, but recognizing moral courage under extreme constraint. As memorial institutions now shoulder the task of preservation, they face difficult questions. How do you present horror without turning it into spectacle? How do you educate without overwhelming? How do you honor victims without reducing them to symbols? Ravensbrück challenges curators and educators to resist simplification. It demands complexity, acknowledgement of victim diversity, perpetrator responsibility, bystander complicity, and survivor resilience, all without false balance or dilution of truth. The camp's history refuses neat conclusions. Liberation did not erase trauma. Trials did not deliver full justice. Memory did not guarantee prevention. And yet, forgetting would be worse. Today, visitors walk the grounds where barracks once stood, often surprised by the quiet. The silence is deceptive. Beneath it lies the accumulated weight of tens of thousands of lives shaped and ended there. Ravensbrück does not scream. It waits. It waits to see whether its lessons will be engaged seriously or absorbed passively, whether it will be treated as a closed chapter or a mirror held up to the present. The final responsibility no longer belongs to the SS, the guards, or even the survivors. It belongs to those who inherit the knowledge. To remember Ravensbrück is not only to look back, but to ask uncomfortable questions about power, obedience, and moral responsibility now. The women imprisoned there were stripped of almost everything, yet their stories remain, demanding attention, demanding honesty, and demanding that remembrance be more than ritual. Ravensbrück endures not because it was unique, but because it was possible. And that possibility, the survivors warned, is never confined to the past. Chapter 10, Segment 1. After the gates opened, survival, displacement, and the struggle to live again. When the gates of Ravensbrück finally ceased to function as instruments of imprisonment, the suffering inside them did not simply end. Liberation was not a single moment of relief, but the beginning of another uncertain and painful chapter for the women who survived. Many were too weak to understand what freedom meant. Some could not stand. Others could not eat without risking death. Disease, trauma, and exhaustion followed them beyond the barbed wire, clinging to bodies that had been pushed far past their limits. For thousands of women, survival did not mean recovery. It meant enduring a new phase of dislocation, grief, and struggle in a world that had been fundamentally altered by war. In the days immediately following liberation, medical teams confronted a humanitarian catastrophe. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and severe malnutrition were rampant. Doctors and nurses, often overwhelmed and under-resourced, had to relearn how to treat starvation victims without killing them. Food, something survivors had dreamed about endlessly, now had to be rationed carefully. Eating too much, too fast, could trigger fatal shock. Many women died after liberation, their bodies unable to adjust to nourishment after years of deprivation. The cruelty of this reality, surviving the camp only to die afterward, underscored how deeply Ravensbrück had damaged its prisoners. For those who stabilized, the next challenge was displacement. Entire communities had been destroyed. Homes no longer existed. Families had vanished. Borders had shifted. Some women returned to countries that no longer recognized them, while others discovered that anti-Semitism, political repression, or poverty still awaited them. Survivors from Eastern Europe often found their towns occupied by new populations, their property seized, their presence unwelcome. Jewish survivors faced continued hostility, sometimes violence, even after the revelation of Nazi crimes. Political prisoners returning to Soviet-controlled territories were not celebrated as victims, but interrogated as potential traitors. Liberation did not guarantee safety. It often meant facing suspicion, silence, or renewed persecution. Psychological trauma accompanied every step. Ravensbrück had been designed not only to punish bodies, but to fracture identities. Years of humiliation, arbitrary violence, and constant fear had reshaped how survivors saw themselves and the world. Many struggled with guilt for having lived while others died, a burden known later as survivor's guilt. Nightmares, flashbacks, and emotional numbness were common, though rarely understood or treated at the time. Mental health support was minimal, and the expectation to move on was strong. Societies rebuilding after war often wanted narratives of victory and resilience, not reminders of suffering that complicated national myths. Survivors learned quickly that their stories made others uncomfortable. Silence, once imposed by terror, now returned as social pressure. Some women spoke immediately, driven by urgency and rage. Others could not speak for decades or ever. Their experiences were too painful, too complex, or too unwelcome. Meanwhile, the material realities of survival pressed relentlessly. Many former prisoners were penniless, physically disabled, or chronically ill. Employment was difficult. Education had been interrupted. Women who had been young adults upon imprisonment emerged into middle age without careers, families, or stability. For some, forming relationships felt impossible after years of dehumanization. Trust had been systematically destroyed inside the camp, where betrayal could mean death. Relearning how to live among others required time, patience, and support that was often unavailable. Yet even within these hardships, survivors displayed remarkable resilience. Some became activists, educators, writers, and witnesses. They organized support networks for fellow survivors, especially women who felt doubly marginalized, as former prisoners and as women in post-war societies that often minimized female suffering. They testified in war crimes trials, despite the personal cost of reliving trauma. They insisted that Ravensbrück be recognized not as a footnote, but as a central part of the Nazi system of terror. Their efforts were not driven by hope for justice alone, but by fear of forgetting. They understood that memory was fragile, and that denial begins when stories are dismissed as inconvenient or exaggerated. For many survivors, the question was never whether they could forget Ravensbrück, but whether the world would. In the early post-war years, the camp's history was often overshadowed by larger narratives of the Holocaust or by Cold War politics that shaped which crimes were emphasized and which were ignored. Ravensbrück, a camp primarily for women, struggled for recognition in male-dominated historical accounts. Its victims were sometimes portrayed as passive sufferers rather than active resistors, a distortion survivors worked tirelessly to correct. The struggle to live again, therefore, was not only personal but historical. Survivors fought to reclaim their voices, their dignity, and their place in the record. The gates had opened, but the work of survival, physical, psychological, and moral, had only just begun. Chapter 10, Segment 2, Justice Attempted, Trials, Testimony, and the Limits of Accountability. In the years that followed liberation, the world confronted a question it was unprepared to answer fully. How does one deliver justice for crimes that were industrial in scale, bureaucratic in nature, and committed across an entire continent? Ravensbrück posed this question with particular force. Unlike extermination camps designed primarily for immediate death, Ravensbrück was a place of prolonged suffering. Forced labor, medical experimentation, starvation, torture, executions, and psychological destruction carried out over years. Translating that slow, systemic cruelty into legal responsibility proved painfully difficult. Yet survivors demanded accountability, not as revenge, but as recognition that what had happened to them was a crime against humanity, not an unfortunate consequence of war. The first attempts at justice emerged through Allied war crimes investigations. Testimonies from Ravensbrück survivors were gathered, often under exhausting conditions, sometimes only weeks after liberation. Many women were still ill, malnourished, and traumatized when they were asked to recount years of abuse in precise detail. They described beatings, selections, executions, experiments that left permanent injuries, and the casual sadism of guards who treated suffering as routine. These testimonies became the foundation of prosecutions, yet the burden placed on survivors was immense. They were asked to remember exact dates, names, and actions from a time when survival itself required mental dissociation. Any inconsistency could be used to challenge credibility. Justice demanded precision from people whose lives had been deliberately shattered. The Ravensbrück trials, held primarily by British military courts between 1946 and 1948, sought to prosecute camp officials, guards, and medical personnel. Several dozen individuals were charged with war crimes, including murder, ill-treatment, and participation in medical experiments. Some were convicted and executed. Others received prison sentences. For the first time, female SS guards were publicly tried and held responsible, a significant moment in recognizing that women, too, could be perpetrators of extreme violence within the Nazi system. Yet, even at the time, many survivors felt the scope of justice was painfully limited. Thousands of perpetrators had passed through Ravensbrück over its years of operation. Only a fraction ever stood trial. Many escaped, reintegrated into post-war society, or benefited from shifting political priorities as Cold War tensions began to dominate Europe. The legal frameworks of the time struggled to address crimes that were not isolated acts but components of a vast system. Responsibility was often narrowly defined, focusing on direct acts of killing while overlooking the administrative, medical, and supervisory roles that enabled mass suffering. Bureaucrats who signed orders, doctors who selected victims under the guise of science, and officials who enforced starvation policies frequently avoided prosecution because their actions were framed as legal under Nazi law. Survivors watched as men and women who had once exercised absolute power over life and death resumed ordinary lives. Some became doctors again. Others entered civil service or business. This reality deepened a sense of betrayal. The promise of never again rang hollow when accountability appeared selective and incomplete. For many former prisoners, the trials were both necessary and insufficient, a symbolic acknowledgement that did not fully confront the scale of what had been done. The emotional toll of participating in these proceedings was severe. Survivors were cross-examined by defense lawyers who questioned their memory, motives, and mental stability. They were forced to relive trauma in courtrooms where perpetrators sat only meters away. Some testified repeatedly, traveling across countries to appear in different trials. Others refused to testify at all, unable to endure the psychological cost. Both choices carried weight. Speaking risked reopening wounds. Silence risked allowing denial to take root. Despite these challenges, survivor testimony became one of the most powerful tools against historical erasure. Their words entered court records, archives, and eventually textbooks. They established facts that denial could not easily dismiss. Over time, these testimonies shaped international law itself. Crimes committed at Ravensbrück contributed to the development of concepts such as crimes against humanity, medical ethics standards, and the recognition of sexual and gender-based violence as war crimes. Although justice at the individual level remained incomplete, the legal legacy of these trials extended far beyond the defendants in the courtroom. Yet justice was not only a legal matter, it was also a moral and social reckoning. In post-war Germany, confronting Ravensbrück was slow and uneven. For years, public discourse minimized or avoided discussion of concentration camps, focusing instead on German suffering during bombing campaigns and displacement. Former SS members often portrayed themselves as victims of circumstance rather than agents of terror. Survivors encountered denial, defensiveness, or indifference when they spoke. Recognition came gradually, often pushed forward by survivor activism rather than state initiative. Memorials were delayed. Educational programs were limited. The full history of Ravensbrück, especially its role as a camp for women, struggled to find space in national memory. Justice, in this sense, was not a verdict but an ongoing struggle. Survivors understood that accountability was not only about punishment, but about truth. To name what happened accurately, to record it honestly, and to teach it without euphemism was itself a form of justice. Even when courts failed, memory could still hold perpetrators accountable in the long arc of history. The trials closed, sentences were served or ignored, but the question remained unresolved. How many crimes can go unanswered before justice loses meaning? Ravensbrück forced the world to confront that question and offered no easy answers. Chapter 10, Segment 3, Memory, Warning, and the Duty to Remember. As the courtrooms emptied and the final verdicts of the Ravensbrück trials were handed down, the camp itself entered a new and uncertain phase, one shaped not by barbed wire and watchtowers, but by memory, silence, and the long struggle over how history would be told. Ravensbrück did not vanish like some camps that were deliberately erased by the SS. Its structures remained, standing in uneasy quiet beside the lake, bearing physical witness to crimes that words could barely contain. Yet survival of buildings did not guarantee survival of truth. In the years immediately after the war, the campsite was repurposed by Soviet authorities, used first as a military base and detention area. This secondary use layered new suffering over old ground, complicating remembrance and delaying public recognition of Ravensbrück's original purpose. For survivors, returning to the site, when they were allowed to return at all, was often an overwhelming experience. The place where they had been reduced to numbers, where friends had died beside them, now stood stripped of its terror but heavy with its absence. Memory, they realized, was fragile. Without deliberate preservation, even a place like Ravensbrück could fade into abstraction, reduced to a footnote rather than confronted as a warning. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Ravensbrück occupied an uneasy position in historical consciousness. In East Germany, it was officially memorialized, but within a rigid political framework that emphasized communist resistance while marginalizing Jewish suffering, Roma victims, and the broader system of persecution. In West Germany, acknowledgement came more slowly, hindered by denial, defensiveness, and the desire to move forward without fully reckoning with the past. Survivors found themselves caught between competing narratives, their experiences filtered through ideology rather than fully heard. Many women who had endured Ravensbrück returned to lives marked by illness, trauma, infertility caused by experiments, and social isolation. They were expected to rebuild quietly, often without support, carrying memories few wanted to confront. Speaking publicly about what had happened was discouraged, dismissed as reopening wounds best left closed. Silence, once imposed by terror, was now reinforced by social discomfort. Yet memory persisted, carried stubbornly by those who refused to let the camp be forgotten. Survivor associations formed, organizing commemorations, recording testimonies, and demanding recognition. These women understood that remembrance was not automatic. It had to be fought for, protected, and passed on deliberately. They returned again and again to Ravensbrück, guiding younger generations through its grounds, naming buildings, recounting routines of suffering, and insisting that the camp be understood not as an anomaly but as part of a system that modern society had allowed to function. Their voices gradually reshaped how Ravensbrück was remembered, expanding the narrative beyond political categories to include the full spectrum of victims and the specific gendered violence women endured: forced sterilizations, sexual abuse, and the exploitation of female bodies under the guise of labor and medicine. By the late 20th century, Ravensbrück had become a formal memorial site, with exhibitions, archives, and educational programs dedicated to preserving its history. This transformation, however, did not mark the end of responsibility. Memorialization carries its own dangers: the risk that repetition dulls impact, that ritual replaces understanding, that horror becomes distant and abstract. Ravensbrück challenges visitors not merely to feel sorrow, but to ask uncomfortable questions. How did a society known for culture, philosophy, and law construct a camp designed to destroy women slowly and systematically? How did neighbors, doctors, engineers, and administrators become participants, active or passive, in a machinery of cruelty? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what conditions allowed such a system to be normalized without widespread resistance? The legacy of Ravensbrück is not confined to the past. It lives in the ethical frameworks shaped in response to its crimes, in modern human rights law, medical ethics, and international criminal justice. The abuses committed in its infirmaries helped define global standards governing consent and experimentation. The forced labor system influenced discussions about corporate responsibility during wartime. The camp's existence stands as evidence that genocide does not require secrecy alone. It can operate in plain sight when bureaucracy, obedience, and dehumanization align. Remembering Ravensbrück, therefore, is not an act of mourning alone. It is an act of vigilance. For educators, historians, and visitors today, the challenge is to resist simplification. Ravensbrück was not only a place of suffering. It was also a place where women shared food they did not have, taught one another songs in whispered voices, and formed networks of mutual care under conditions designed to eliminate solidarity. Resistance did not always look like revolt. Often it took the form of remembering names, tending to the sick, or refusing to surrender one's humanity. These acts matter because they complicate the narrative of victimhood without diminishing suffering. They remind us that even within systems of total control, moral choices still existed, though the cost of making them was often unbearable. The final responsibility lies with those who did not live through Ravensbrück but inherit its memory. As survivors age and pass away, the task of remembrance shifts from lived testimony to collective obligation. History does not preserve itself. Without education, denial grows. Without confrontation, repetition becomes possible. Ravensbrück warns us that camps are not built overnight, that cruelty is often introduced gradually, wrapped in language of order, security, and necessity. To remember Ravensbrück honestly is to recognize early signs of dehumanization wherever they appear, in policy, rhetoric, or silence. Ravensbrück stands today not as a relic of a finished chapter, but as a question addressed to every generation. What will you do with this knowledge? The women who suffered there left behind more than ashes and ruins. They left a demand that their suffering be understood, that their lives be honored, and that the systems which destroyed them never be allowed to rise again. Remembering Ravensbrück is not optional. It is the price of moral inheritance, and the cost of forgetting is one humanity cannot afford. Ravensbrück was not an accident of war. It was not chaos, and it was not madness. It was a system carefully planned, efficiently administered, and carried out by ordinary people who chose obedience over conscience. Behind its fences, women were starved, worked, experimented on, and murdered not in moments of frenzy, but through routine. Paperwork replaced morality. Discipline replaced empathy. Silence replaced resistance. The story of Ravensbrück forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Genocide does not begin with violence alone. It begins with exclusion, with language that divides, with laws that strip humanity away piece by piece. Long before the camp gates closed, society had already learned to look away. Yet even here, in a place designed to erase dignity, something endured. Women shared crumbs of bread. They whispered names so they would not be forgotten. They cared for one another when caring was forbidden. Survival itself became resistance. Ravensbrück stands today not only as a memorial to suffering, but as a warning written into history. A warning that cruelty can be normalized, that systems can kill without chaos, that memory is the final defense against repetition. If we remember Ravensbrück honestly, not as distant tragedy, but as a human failure with human perpetrators, then the voices silenced there still speak. And the responsibility to listen now belongs to us. May their memory remain eternal.